If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel and also don't forget to click on the notification bell so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network. The Gangster disciples are said to be at least 40,000 strong in numbers and continue to grow with members as young as pre-teen and members as old as in their 70s. The GDN has a hell of a legacy of expansion, power and dominance. The Gangster disciples have grown beyond just being a gang and are about growth and development. Growth and development is something positive that turns Gangster disciple members into productive members of society and helps men of all ages better themselves and become successful. Not all Gangster disciples get involved in criminal activity, and many retire and leave the criminal life and become productive members of growth and development. The history of the Gangster disciple nation has roots that come from civil rights issues and dealing with problems that plagued their communities. It came time to fight back. From the rough parts of Hyde Park to the impoverished and blighted community of Englewood, the disciples were born. They would evolve to show the world true power in numbers and organization. We will start the story back in the year 1958 to the impoverished northern half of the Hyde Park neighborhood, the impoverished southern Kenwood area and in Englewood. In Hyde Park and Kenwood, wealthier white greaser youths were bullying several black youths. Hyde Park had always enforced restrictive racial covenants in the earlier times, but in the late 40s it was deemed unconstitutional. Therefore, black families began to move into the older northern section of the Hyde Park neighborhood. By the later 50s, blacks were moving into this area and southern Kenwood at a higher rate as this area became more affordable. In Englewood, black families began moving in at a very high rate in this neighborhood, causing many Italian families and Italian greasers resentment, and soon bullying ensued. There were also white and black gangs from outside of Englewood, Hyde Park and Kenwood that invaded and bullied these youths. Some of the bullied youths from Kenwood, Hyde Park and Englewood got together as friends and decided to create a club that would fight against all these enemies they had. These boys were only 11 to 13 years old in age, and they all sat down to figure out the name of this new organization. They decided to flip through the Holy Bible to get ideas, and that's when it dawned on them to use the name disciple in their title. The boys then added on the prefix devils to give the name an intimidating edge to it. After that was decided, the disciples were simultaneously at 49th and Dorchester in Kenwood, 53rd and Kimbark in Hyde Park, and scattered throughout Englewood between 56th Street down to 67th Street. Some founding members were Richard Champ Strong, David Barksdale, Mingo Shreed, Prince Oldtimer, Kilroy, Leonard Longstreet, Nightwalker and various others. The disciples had no central leader in their earliest days, and they kept their business out of the press. The disciples established headquarters at the Hyde Park intersection of 53rd and Kimbark, which became their very first stronghold. The disciples created the symbols of the Star of David, pitchfork and devil's tail with devil horns when they formed in 1958. The first arch-enemy of the disciple was the Rebels, which was a white gang of greasers in Englewood, West Englewood and Gage Park. There were over 2,000 rebels, and they were very racist toward blacks. Disciples also fought with other black gangs in Englewood like the Egyptian Cobras that moved to the neighborhood from the west side of Chicago in 1958. Disciples also fought with the Blackstone Raiders that had settled along Garfield Boulevard. The Raiders would eventually become the Blackstone Rangers, then eventually Black P. Stones. In the year 1959, disciples made their first expansion move as they settled in the western part of the Woodlawn community west of Woodlawn Avenue, as they took over about 2/3 of the Woodlawn neighborhood. The other 1/3 was all Blackstone Ranger territory who became arch rivals, along with more Egyptian Cobras that had settled there as well. As the years of 1958 to 1961 went by, the disciples became especially powerful in northern Englewood as white flight ran its course and more black families moved and created excellent recruiting opportunities. By 1961, the Devil's Disciples were the most powerful gang in Englewood, and the Italian greaser gangs were fighting that losing war against the disciples. In the year 1961, 14-year-old David Barksdale took over leadership of the Devil's Disciples, and he directly oversaw the Englewood branch of the Disciples. Barksdale appointed Mingo as president of the Disciples in Hyde Park and Kenwood that became known as East Side Disciples. Barksdale set to work absorbing several other small gangs on the south side, turning them into disciple gangs. These gangs would still retain their original name, but all groups would all have the last name of Disciple. All other branches of disciples outside of Englewood had their own president. The Hyde Park Kenwood chapter was at its peak around when Barksdale took over, as they had members from 43rd down to 53rd between the two neighborhoods, but starting in 1960, the University of Chicago backed a program to renovate southern Kenwood and northern Hyde Park by clearing out slum buildings and renovating some of the older and salvageable homes. This action would increase the value of these neighborhoods and push impoverished black families out, causing most of these families to move to Englewood. As the families began moving in the early 60s, the disciples grew stronger in Englewood, and gradually a new headquarters was set up at 63rd and Normal in the year 1963, because many homes were raised at 53rd and Kimbark in Hyde Park, and the Kimbark Shopping Plaza was built over half of disciple headquarters. In the same year that David Barksdale took over power of the disciples, Richard Strong and his family moved into the Cabrini Green public housing projects that was mostly ran by various small gangs and Egyptian cobras. Strong developed quite a following in no time and recruited several black youths into the Devil's Disciples. This is the story of how black disciples and gangster disciples first landed in Cabrini Green. Now that we began the story with the creation of the disciples, let's look into the formation of the gangsters. This took place in Englewood in the year 1964, more specifically at 68th and Green. A group of 30 young black youths got together at this intersection as they hung out in Larry Hoover's home and watched outside the window as gangsters and pimps hung out in the parking lot of the Guys and Gals nightclub that used to exist at that intersection. These boys wanted to be just like these pimps and gangsters, and they were living on the border of Ranger and Disciple territory. Larry Hoover was inspired to be a leader of gangsters and began dressing himself very well to fit the role. Eventually these boys created their own club called the Supreme Gangsters, which was Larry Hoover's idea for the club name. Larry Hoover himself was not the first official leader, but more of a behind-the-scenes type leader. Hoover teamed up with street hustler Andrew D.T. Howard and King Ike Taylor and made King Ike his right-hand man. The Supreme Gangsters wore the color black, and their symbols were a heart with wings and a round crown with a sword going through it. The Supreme Gangsters saluted each other with a clenched fist as their hand sign. Robert Cold Black Doherty's was released from prison in 1981 and was appointed by Larry Hoover to come to the Stateway Gardens projects and the Robert Taylor projects and flip many BGDN members into BGD members as the gangsters took over the area of Pershing Road and 43rd Street in the Robert Taylors and the majority of the Stateways. At the same time Mickey Bull Johnson flipped the rest of the BGDN into the Black Disciples in the Robert Taylors and Stateway Gardens. The Del Vikings were the dominant gang in both sets of projects, until most of them flipped to Black Disciples, while some others flipped the BGD. The Black Gangster Disciples were now very strong in the public housing buildings, and there were over 400 members in Cabrini Green alone in 1981. This was also the year the lucrative Gangster Disciple and Black Disciple drug operations began in Cabrini Green, Robert Taylor and Stateway Gardens that would become legendary in later years. Also in the year 1981, Larry Hoover began to draw the BGDs into politics as he established bylaws for BGDs not to harm prison guards or any prison staff unless ordered to do so. In 1982, he stepped up his organization as he established Brothers of the Struggle as official, and this time only for BGDs. He sent out memos to top leaders geared toward bettering the organization and encouraging members to refine themselves. In 1982, the wars between BGDs and BDs almost came to an end after Dirk Acklin was released from prison and disapproved of how powerful Jerome Freeman had become. Dirk then created his own group of black disciples to go against Freeman's called the Asiatic Apostles, and a civil war began within the BDs. As a result of this war, relations between BGDs and BDs smoothed over as these two BD factions were focused and removing each other until Dirk Acklin's BDs went back to the rest of the BDs in 1983 or 1984. In the year 1986, the El Ruckins faced indictment that caused some harm to their organization. After this happened, the BGDs experienced a major boost in numbers and now outnumbered El Ruckins Black P. Stones in the city. This even involved the BGDs even becoming the new dominating force over the drug trade after the Stones ran it for nearly 20 years. This was also the year that Junior Hope was running all the street operations for the BGDs. In March of 1987, Larry Hoover was seen as becoming reformed, especially after his 1981 policy about not harming prison staff. This all granted him a transfer to Vienna Correctional Center in Vienna, Illinois, which is a minimum security prison. It was in this prison where Larry Hoover now conducted business easier since security was much lower. After Larry Hoover was transferred to a minimum security facility, all hell broke loose in Statesville and in Pontiac Prison, as now Larry was no longer around to smooth things over. At Pontiac Prison, members of the BGDs conspired to murder Superintendent Robert Taylor for the purpose of avenging mistreatment against BGD members by prison staff. These BGDs wanted revenge for the death of Billy Zodiac Jones and Kirk Williams, who both died while choking on cocaine they were trying to conceal. When BGD Harry Martin was apprehended and charged for the murder, he claimed Larry Hoover gave him the order to kill this prison staff member. Upon investigation, it was proven Larry had no ties to this. However, the damage was done because Martin gave up lots of other information about how the BGDs were ran and how they govern, and this led to other investigations. At the time this was happening, Larry Hoover was actually working on a positive program he created that was aimed at steering the BGDs further away from being a criminal organization. He created Better Growth and Development and declared BGD stood for those words. Better growth and development concepts were to help GDs better themselves and to help better their community instead of fueling the problems that existed in their neighborhoods. It was also a way for BGDs to become legitimately successful and become productive men and women of society. Better Growth and Development was not official and was not even released to the public at this time. In the year 1988, Michael G. took over leadership of all street operations of the Black Gangster Disciples. In the years between 1988 and 1989, the drug trade became increasingly competitive in the Englewood neighborhood between BGDs and BDs, and this resulted in a string of violent shootings between these gangs that year that left some bad feelings between BGDs and BDs in Englewood. It was also foreshadowing what was to become in later years. For now, this clash was squashed later in the year. In the year 1990, Cold Black was running the BGDs, but only for a short time in that year. This was also the year that Better Growth and Development was finally shared for the first time among trusted BGD heads. It was not made public or official yet. Because let's be honest, who wants a bunch of educated black men running around like the Black Panthers? Better to keep them misinformed and warring with each other. In the summer of 1991, BGDs gunned down Mickey Bull. After that happened, the Black Disciples got revenge on August 7, 1991, by gunning down multiple members of the BGDs in Englewood. After this shooting, a group of BGDs from 66th Street started calling themselves Gangster Disciples, dropping the B or Black out of their name. This was the beginning of BGDs transitioning to being just known as GDs. As this violence between BGDs and BDs ensued in 1991, Larry Hoover was trying to demonstrate to many of his members the growth and development ways. The name was slightly changed, leaving out the better part that was part of the original 1987 plan. This was another step toward GD becoming the new ways. However, growth and development had nothing to do with the name change or the violence. It was purely coincidental, because the initials of growth and development were GD, and that certain section on 66th was calling themselves GDs. Between 1991 to 1993, the wars between BGDs and BDs was so severe that members of each gang couldn't hardly walk around the neighborhood without getting shot at by each other. It was almost like you couldn't even move a muscle. During this time, more and more Englewood BGDs began to call themselves GDs, and more were dropping the B. In 1993, the BDs and BGDs reached some peace, but it only lasted a year or two, then war became permanent. This was also the year that Growth and Development became official and was publicly released. This was also the year that the BGDs officially became Gangster Disciples. Some members still used BGD until 1994, including Gator, that went before the White House in January of 1994 and spoke about better growth and development. By 1993, the Gangster Disciples were trying a new political move known as 21st Century Vote, which was an attempt to get Gangster Disciple members into politics. To the public, it was meant to help rehab neighborhoods and bring about positive change, but critics and law enforcement saw it as a way to help expand Gangster Disciple illegal operations. At that same time in 1993, Larry Hoover was trying to get out of prison and was up for parole. Over 10,000 members of the Gangster Disciples gathered at a large picnic in Kankakee, Illinois, where Larry Hoover gave a speech, not live, to all the GDs there. He further expanded on growth and development, which was the new term Larry Hoover wanted to use to replace the Gangster Disciples term. As I said before, growth and development concepts were to help GDs better themselves and to help better their community instead of fueling the problems that existed in their neighborhoods. Afterward, there was a flood of letters to Governor Jim Ryan, pleading with him to allow the parole of Larry Hoover. However, Larry Hoover was denied parole. Things only got worse in 1995, when the Chicago police launched Operation Headache, which took down 39 high-ranking members of the Gangster Disciples, including Larry Hoover and Andrew Howard, who had been on parole since 1992. Larry Hoover was brought up on several drug conspiracy charges that dated all the way back to 1970, which was the time when the GDs started to operate a major drug cartel, mostly of cocaine and heroin. Hoover and several of his top generals and lieutenants were being arraigned on charges of supplying small-time dealers, extorting money, and running their own drug cartel that was worth millions of dollars. By the end of the trials in 1997, Larry Hoover was transferred to United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado, which is a super maximum security prison, which effectively cut off over 95% of Hoover's communication with the outside world. During the 1990s, recruitment of Hispanics and whites exploded mainly in the suburbs, as the Gangster Disciples appeared to be a mixed-race organization out the burbs, but in the city, it was still a vast majority black organization, besides some territory in the uptown area and some other north side areas. Upon inception, the Supreme Gangsters were immediately at war with the Blackstone Rangers and Egyptian Cobras, but had no hard feelings against Disciples. Supreme Gangsters were the newer organization in Englewood, and this made them the target of Blackstone Rangers that wanted to flush them out right away, but the Gangsters fought the Rangers viciously. The Supreme Gangsters were hustlers and were about getting money early in their history before Disciples and Rangers were as much about it. In the year 1965, the leader of the Supreme Gangsters was no longer in charge, and Larry Hoover stepped up to be the official leader of the Supreme Gangsters, instead of being a behind-the-scenes leader. After Larry Hoover took over, the Supreme Gangsters began to grow in Englewood and became a major force to be reckoned with as Rangers struggled in battles with them. The Devil's Disciples were the largest gang on the south side by 1965, and before, even after the Blackstone Rangers started, Rangers were not as large. The Rangers only appeared larger because they were more outspoken to media outlets. The Supreme Gangsters were up and coming and even began recruiting older members that were even above high school age. Larry Hoover was becoming increasingly recognized, respected and feared by many. He was only 13 years old when he started the Supreme Gangsters, and by the age of 14, he was in charge of older guys. On the date of January 6, 1966, the Disciples perceived the Rangers as a threat due to their aggressive recruitment measures. In order to counteract this threat, David Barksdale had the idea to create a unity among several gangs on the south side that mutually hated the Rangers. This was to be a coalition that would absorb these gangs under one Disciple Nation. This new coalition would become known as the Black Disciple Nation. The coalition expanded Disciple boundaries beyond the Englewood, Hyde Park and Kenwood area and put them in further south side neighborhoods like Greater Grand Crossing, Woodlawn, Washington Park, as they absorbed up several small black gangs in all these communities, causing Disciple numbers to grow into the thousands. Every gang that absorbed into the Black Disciple Nation adopted the last name of Disciple. This spreading of this nation did not gain much notoriety due to Disciples keeping the activity low-key, therefore, you don't read much about it in the history books. What you will read all about is how the rival Black Peace Stone Nation spread all over the place after that nation was created in May of 1966 to counteract the Black Disciple Nation. Again, it was because Stones were more outspoken to media outlets. Now that there were the powerful Black Disciple and Black Peace Stone alliances at war with each other, the much smaller Supreme Gangsters, Larry Hoover now felt the need to create his own countermeasure against the Black Peace Stones. He adopted the same belief as the Disciples in keeping out of media outlets and having a code of silence, hence why the new Gangster Nation alliance flew under the radar when it started in 1966 and through the rest of the 60s. The Gangsters absorbed several black gangs that all hated Stones and didn't want to be Disciples from as far south as 71st Street. All organizations that joined the Gangster Nation adopted the last name of Gangster to show allegiance. One thing people tend to get twisted is that the Supreme Gangsters were known as the High Supreme Gangsters. In reality, the High Supreme Gangsters were just a branch of Supreme Gangsters from 71st Street. Another branch on 71st was the Imperial Gangsters, once again another name that gets confused as a Supreme Gangster official title. In 1966, the Black Disciple Nation became heavily active in the community, opening fundraisers, legitimate businesses, enforcing school policies to keep kids in school. There are many sources on the internet that can go into great detail about all the legal things the Black Disciple Nation and the Black Gangster Disciple Nation did back in the 1960s that is very easy to find. Therefore, I do not need to go into extended details about it, but there was some positivity that came out of all of this. Maybe some of that money went to illegal activities, but a great deal of it went into helping the community. David Barksdale used his power for some good, as can be seen. The Disciples were also tied to civil rights groups and fought against civil rights injustices. In that summer of 1966, Disciples even tried a peace treaty with the Rangers. This didn't last, but at least there was a large attempt. In the month of September in the year 1967, Ike Taylor moved to the intersection of Gladys and Keeler in the K-Town section of Chicago's West Side in the West Garfield Park neighborhood. When he arrived, he began spreading the word of the Gangster Nation to these young West Side youths that were mainly familiar with vice lords and Egyptian cobras. King Ike recruited many youths in this area and established the very first supreme gangster branch in history. Ike appointed Robert Red Lawson to be his sergeant of arms, and this was the birth of the Gangster Disciples on the west side of Chicago, and it all started in 1967. The West Side Supreme Gangsters gained quick popularity, especially after they absorbed the Black Pimps and the Jive 5 gangs by the 1970s. The Black Pimps were especially large in the West Garfield Park area, so this became a colossal move for the gangsters, turning them. This gave the gangsters a major momentum boost, and they soon colonized the Henry Horner projects located in the near West Side neighborhood, putting the gangsters on the map in 2 West Side neighborhoods. There really weren't any Disciples or Stones on the West Side, so this was prime opportunity. The only major rival to deal with was the Vice Lords. In the early 1970s, Ike Taylor was convicted of attempted murder and other charges after the shooting of Albert Harris. In the court case of People v. Taylor on December 24, 1974, Albert Harris was walking home from a friend's house and was down the street from where he lived. Harris stopped walking when he heard the clicking sound of a gun. He turned and claimed he saw Ike Taylor standing there holding a pistol. Harris said that Ike said, "It ain't nothing but a gangster thing." Harris then saw another man holding a shotgun in a doorway. Then Henry Heron joined Taylor holding a pistol and Ronald Lawson on the other side of Taylor holding a shotgun. Harris then claimed that Taylor said, "You're busted," then shot Harris in the throat. The man with the shotgun in the doorway fired next and shot Harris in his right side. A 5th shooter suddenly showed up and shot Harris again with a 12-gauge shotgun in the face. Harris then turned to see Taylor, Heron and Lawson standing side by side with flashing sparks coming from their guns. Harris dropped to the ground to crawl away, but then the 6th shooter appeared with a 12-gauge and shot Harris yet again. Harris managed to flee under a car as the men continued to open fire on the car, as Harris could hear all the pellets striking the vehicle. This terrified him so much that he cried out for his mother to save him. His mother heard the frenzy of gunfire and her son cry out, then rushed to the scene as the men fled. Harris was blinded, was left with a difficulty speaking, lost 6 teeth and was left with scars all over, but survived the attack. According to court documents, Lawson was acquitted of the crime, and the other 3 men not named were never found. Ike Taylor and Henry Heron were convicted, and both men protested their innocence. Ike Taylor was able to get the aggravated battery charges removed, but the attempted murder charge stuck. In later years, Ike Taylor would become a positive leader and positive advocate for the growth and development concepts of the Gangster Disciples. In the year 1967, the Woodlawn Organization was awarded over $927,000 to be handed out to the Blackstone Rangers and the Black Disciples to operate job training centers for neighborhood youths in Woodlawn. All Disciples and Rangers were paid a salary to be instructors of this program, despite the lack of training. Disciples received about $360,000 of this money for the program. In these programs there were both disciple and ranger instructors and students in these classrooms, and sometimes gang fights and shootings happened in the classes. In the year 1968, war began between the Black Disciples and Gangster Nation. Larry Hoover became the target for assassination attempts. He was shot on 2 occasions, then on September 4, 1968, a 3rd attempt was made on him. On this day, Englewood was on high alert as the Disciples, Gangsters and Stones were packing guns and ready to shoot each other. At Parker High School, members of the Supreme Gangsters and Disciples were especially ready to get into drama against each other. Barron Disciple member James Highsmith and Disciple co-founder Leonard Longstreet entered Parker High School, even though they weren't students. The two spotted Larry Hoover standing outside of the principal's office, and Highsmith walked past him with a smile. As Longstreet shouted out, "Burn him," Highsmith pulled out a .32 pistol and shot Larry Hoover and 2 others nearby. No one was killed, but Highsmith was convicted of the shooting and sentenced to 5 years. During that fall season of 1968, the guns were blazing all over the South Side as Disciples, Gangsters and Stones were at each other's throats as bodies were dropping. This led to a temporary truce between the 3 organizations that didn't last long, but it was an attempt to curtail the several acts of violence on the South Side. In 1968, not only did the Gangsters open up on the west side of the city, they extended themselves further south outside of Englewood. The Hyde Park stronghold was closed down for the Disciples, as now that area become upper-class income families, and all East Side Disciples and Falcon Disciples moved to Englewood. Gangsters were now just primarily in Englewood and some West Side turf until Gangsters began colonizing south of 68th Street all the way down to 95th Street in the Roseland neighborhood. The Roseland chapter of Gangsters became known as the Outlaw Gangsters, and US was the founder of this branch. This is what started the Wild 100's Gangster Disciples that we know today. In January of 1969, Larry Hoover was highly recognized by David Barksdale and Jeff Fort because the Gangsters had risen to become the third largest outfit on the south side of the city. Both Jeff and David wanted to absorb the Gangsters into their nations, but Larry Hoover looked to Jeff Fort and the Stones first. Now this is where history gets tricky and has caused many disputes on the streets for many years on if Larry Hoover and the Gangsters became Stones. Some will tell you he was a Stone, and others will say no way. The truth lies somewhere in the middle. However, I will say this right now before we go into details: Larry Hoover was never a Stone, and I'll explain it all right now. In January of 1969, Larry Hoover went to Jeff Fort for a peaceful meeting to discuss an alliance. The two leaders agreed on just having an alliance that had no official title. It was simply a truce between Gangsters and Stones, and not a merger in any which way. This alliance was not the same as the Black Disciple type alliance, or Gangster Nation type alliance, or like the Black P Stone type alliance. This was an alliance that kept Gangsters and Stones separate, but would still be governed by Jeff Fort and Larry Hoover, supposedly as equals. Larry came up with the idea for him to rule this alliance alongside Jeff, but Jeff ended up declining this in the long run, because in Jeff's mind, nobody is his equal. The peace between them lasted close to a half year, but ended up going sour as Larry was seeing more and more how Jeff would not let him rule alongside him as an equal. Jeff also came up with the idea for a complete merger of Gangster and Stone concept that he wanted to call the Gangster Stones, but Larry Hoover rejected the idea, especially since Jeff wouldn't let him rule as equals. This and a shooting in May of 1969 when the Stones shot at Supreme Gangsters near Larry Hoover's home were events that brought an end to this alliance. Here are the details of that shooting that pushed things over the edge between Stones and Gangsters. On May 7, 1969, two Supreme Gangsters, Gregory Sanders and Ronald Vandergrift, were shot at by Black P Stones at the corner of 69th and Halsted in the Englewood neighborhood. At the intersection of 69th and Green at address 817 West 69th Street, Old Shrimp Shop that's no longer there. Between 1:30 a.m. to 2 a.m. Ronald Vandergrift came across Lonnie King and Charlie Stone Smith, who were two members of the Double Six Kings, which was a Black P Stone gang. Vandergrift knew Lonnie King, so he began walking and talking with him as they walked towards 69th and Halsted. Lonnie started telling Ronald that he did not belong around there and to stop coming around that neighborhood because Ronald was a Supreme Gangster. Lonnie had no idea about the Gangster and BPS alliance, and somehow Ronald could not convince him of it. Charlie Stone Smith then came around the corner and joined Lonnie in telling Ronald he did not belong around there and to keep his gangsters out. Charlie was ruthless about it and only said it one time, then yanked out his revolver and shot at Ronald 2 times, striking him once in the groin area in his inner left thigh. After Ronald was shot, he ran to the other side of the street. Felix Murray and Gregory Sanders were nearby, both were Supreme Gangsters. And they also fled the scene. Ronald did not get far because of his wound and fell between two cars. Felix Murray then came to help Ronald, and as the two men took off, King and Smith kept shooting at them and grazed Murray. The two men ran 2 blocks away to the corner of 68th and Green, and that is where they met up with Charles Hoover at the family home of Larry Hoover. The two were then taken to the hospital and were treated for their wounds. The hospital called the police about the fact they were shot, but both men declined pressing any charges or naming their assailants, according to court documents. On May 9 at about 4 p.m. Charles Hoover was at the corner of 68th and Halsted and saw the shooters Lonnie King and Charlie Smith. King and Smith told Hoover they were sorry and that they did not know Hoover and the Supreme Gangsters were allies. On May 11, Vandergrift, King, Murray, Smith, Charles Hoover and some others attended a reconciliation meeting at the Black P Stone headquarters, where the shooting was declared an accident due to the fact that the shooters did not know Supreme Gangsters were now allies, according to court documents. Black P Stone Ranger chiefs were the judges in this meeting. In June 1969, Ronald Vandergrift was picked up by CPD for jumping bail, marijuana possession, and 2 charges of aggravated battery, according to court documents. Vandergrift made a deal with CPD and decided to testify all about the shooting and now press charges in exchange for leniency for his crimes. He also came to this decision because by then the Supreme Gangsters had now went back to war with the Stones and were now merged with the Disciples. This opened up a court case of People v. Smith on October 9, 1973, which was a joint indictment of Stephen Smith for an aggravated battery charge and was also being indicted on murder charges from June 2, 1969. He was 20 years old at the time and the leader of the Double Six Kings. In June of 1969, Larry Hoover had completely had enough of the Stones and conferenced with rival David Barksdale instead. David Barksdale wanted the same type of plan that Jeff Fort wanted, which was to absorb gangsters and disciples together as black gangster disciples. David's plan would offer Larry to rule alongside David Barksdale, as both men would become kings. Although this was a merger of concepts, it was not a combination into one gang, it was still an alliance, but a closer conceptual alliance than what Stones had with the gangsters. Larry accepted this offer because him and David would have equal say-so in how the alliance operated. This was a much more attractive deal for Larry Hoover, and he accepted this offer, and this brought about the birth of the Black Gangster Disciple Nation name. Prince Oldtimer was appointed the Prince of the Disciples, while Tennessee the Prince of the Gangsters. Again, this was still just an alliance, but it was a combined concept alliance, unlike the one between the Stones and the Gangsters. All disciple gangs and gangster gangs were all black gangster disciples. Many disciples objected to this and only wanted to see this as a looser alliance, just like how the Stones and Gangsters had it, but the majority ruled, and this was to remain a combined concepts alliance with separate ruling. Now, as far as the gangster-stone thing is concerned, there was a group of gangsters that didn't agree with a merging alliance with the disciples because of their great dissatisfaction toward the disciples. This group thought Jeff Fort's original idea to combine gangster and stone concepts together was a great idea, and when Larry Hoover severed his relationship with Jeff Fort, this group of gangsters was not happy to say the least, and became more upset when the BGDN was assembled. This group refused to link up with the disciples, and even went renegade against the gangsters, and vacated the south side entirely, perhaps with only some members remaining in Roseland on 104th Street. These gangsters pledged allegiance to Jeff Fort as a leader among them emerged called Mooseman. Mooseman became highly respected by Jeff Fort and took these gangsters into the BPSN, making them into the Gangster Stone branch. Mooseman then took these gangsters to the Henry Horner housing projects, where there was already Supreme Gangsters over there, and opened up the Gangster Stones at the 105 Lake Street building. Larry Hoover and the Supreme Gangsters had nothing to do with this move, and this was not tied in any which way to the Gangster Nation. The Gangster Stones just took gangster concepts, especially the concept of making money, and took it to the Henry Horners, while putting Jeff Fort's BPSN on the map for the first and only time on the west side of Chicago. In June of 1969, right after the BGDN was assembled, Vice Lords, Black P. Stones and BGDs all got together to form a coalition known as the Lord Stones and Disciples or LSD. This was a unity of the gangs so they could march on the government and demand equal rights, better jobs, and against the oppression and poverty in their neighborhoods. This coalition effectively slowed down gang violence between these three organizations, even after CVL Incorporated went defunct in the fall of 1970. For the rest of 1969, the LSD coalition really set aside a lot of gang wars as they marched on City Hall, universities and everywhere, until finally in January of 1970, they achieved some success in bringing about the Chicago Plan, which was an agreement to implement the employment of minorities in Chicago's construction industry, Chicago Building Trades Council, 1970. The final agreement lists 3,000 jobs or training positions in 4 categories. But a coalition spokesman claimed that the actual final agreement called for 1,000 jobs in each category. Chicago Defender, January 13, 1970. It was soon discovered in the early 1970s that the Chicago Plan was failing about producing like it should, and by October of 1973, the LSD coalition disbanded. Since 1968, David Barksdale had been working with leaders of the Black P. Stones on several failed peace treaties. By June of 1970, another weak peace treaty was in effect, but this was broken on June 7, 1970, when David Barksdale was shot in his side at a bar at 848 West 69th Street, 69th and Peoria, in the Englewood neighborhood. The shooters were Black P. Stones. Larry Hoover was there with Barksdale when the shooting started and acted quickly after Barksdale was shot by swiftly getting Barksdale into his car. Hoover then raced to St. Bernard's Hospital in Englewood and was accredited with saving David Barksdale's life after Barksdale suffering an M14 bullet wound in his side that passed into his kidneys, causing terrible damage. In the year 1970, the West Side Supreme Gangsters advanced into the West Humboldt Park area, battled the newly arrived Mad Black Souls in a vicious gang war. I don't know how long the Supreme Gangsters lasted in this area, but it is known that the Gangster Disciples never have had established territory in Humboldt Park, so I believe this conquest was either failed or they absorbed into the Black Gangsters' new breeds by 1981. Before the 1970s, Cabrini Green was run by various different gangs, with a good number of Egyptian Cobras and Black Disciples running some of the buildings or parts of buildings. In the early 1970s, a bid for domination of these projects began and first caught wind in the news when 2 officers were shot dead by snipers on the rooftops of the project buildings. There was an existing war between Black Deuces and Egyptian Cobras that prompted police to investigate. This is how serious this war was becoming. In 1971, Richard Strong, the Cabrini Green disciple founder, started a group called the Blacks, which was a civil rights group that aimed to help the people of Cabrini Green facing injustices. Eventually the Blacks and the Deuces would merge together, then eventually merge into the Black Disciples. The war ran its course, and by about 1972 the Disciples and Cobras dominated these buildings. In the early 1970s, investigations into street gangs using government funding for illegal activities came to a close as they now had evidence to convict high-ranking gang members from the Black P. Stones. In 1971 top leaders of the Black P. Stones were officially charged, and by 1972 Jeff Fort was sentenced to 4 years in prison. The investigations didn't stop with the Stones though. Investigators went after the vice lords and shut down their alleged businesses, then they aimed their crosshairs at the Black Gangster Disciples. Authorities ended up getting Mingo to testify before the grand jury against his own organization. However, no charges were brought upon the Disciples, but government funding was cut off. Stones and vice lords had members testify against their own gangs in these proceedings and caused vice lords and Stones to face prison time. But Mingo's testimony failed to convict anyone. Instead, Mingo was severely beaten on the streets by the Disciples for snitching on his own kind. The same exact money that convicted the Stones somehow didn't get the Disciples convicted, even though both groups were technically mismanaging funds. It seemed like the government just had it out for the Stones more. Not only that, the Disciples didn't seek out this money, it was kinda forced on them as equal payment to them to not favor Stones. Disciples weren't big with talking to the media and stayed out of the spotlight unlike the Stones, so perhaps this helped their case and kept them less of a target of the government. A harsh conviction did come down on the Disciples in 1973, though when on February 26, 1973 Larry Hoover ordered the death of William Pookie Young, a 19-year-old drug dealer in the neighborhood that stole drugs and money from the BGDs. Larry Hoover then ordered Andrew Howard to kill him, and it all happened at 68th and Union in the Englewood neighborhood in an alley. Young was shot 6 times in the head. On March 16 both men were arrested and charged with the murder. By November 5, 1973, Hoover and Howard were sentenced to 150 to 200 years in prison in Statesville Correctional Facility in Crest Hill, Illinois. As Larry Hoover was now sitting in prison while David Barksdale was the main face for the BGDN in the streets, David also started to become very ill. In 1974, David Barksdale began to suffer serious health problems as his kidneys were slowly shutting down. The 1970 assassination attempt by the Black P. Stones may not have initially killed him, but in the long run, it brought an agonizing fate that led to his death on September 2, 1974. The fond memory would live on of King David as a positive leader that truly worked to better lives for disciples. David Barksdale was no drug dealer, he was no killer, or at least not on record he wasn't, he was barely even a criminal. He was the king of the disciples, but when you look at his old rap sheet you really couldn't tell. David wasn't full of money and power like Jeff Ford, and he didn't even make money like Larry did. On record he was a small-time hustler that committed petty crimes, and he had no real felonies on his record. After Barksdale's passing in 1974, he was dearly missed especially by the gangs allied with the BGDN. Some of the disciples were not as mournful as they began doing their own thing and not following BGDN laws. These disciples had always held a grudge from 1968 when gangsters and disciples were at war. These disciple groups also violated the rules because they lost respect for BGDN and also acted independently. Sometimes gangsters and disciples would erupt on each other in certain parts of the city. There was no chief there to make sure the alliance stayed intact on the streets now that David was dead and Larry was locked up. The disciples didn't even have a leader at all anywhere and became wild in many areas. These wilder groups of disciples that were also bitter about 1968 decided to no longer honor BGDN, which caused some violence between gangsters and disciples. By the year 1976, Larry Hoover wanted to reach a resolution to absolve this 2-year disorganization between disciples and gangsters and to carry on the legacy that David Barksdale had left. All of the gangster groups agreed with Larry. Larry had earned a lot of respect from the majority of the disciples, and they were on board as well with a resolve to make the BGDN more than just an alliance. It would be a complete merger into one nation, and the idea would bring about organization and complete unity. However, some disciples were dissatisfied with this idea, many of which were the same disciples that fractured away from the BGDN after David's death. The new BGD Nation did become official that year, and the majority of disciples became black gangster disciples alongside the Gangsters and Larry Hoover, but the rest of the disciples led by Dirk Acklin split away entirely and brought back the name Black Disciples. This time it meant one organization and not an alliance. As soon as Dirk Acklin organized the Black Disciples, an immediate civil war began between BDs and BGDs that brought bloodshed on the streets. In the prison system, BGDs and BDs were at each other's throats with no resolve, and there was basically chaos everywhere. Although there was a split on the streets, there wasn't as much clarification on the difference between BGD and BD, but in prison it was very clear. During all these wars, Larry Hoover always tried to look for ways to end violence between all the gangs. His overall grand vision was for there to be peace among the nations, and if there needed to war, he wanted it controlled exactly like how the Italian mafia controls their gang wars. Sorta like FBG Duck attempted to do in the modern day. Larry never liked messy wars and uncontrolled bloodshed, nor did he even agree with prison rape. In later years, Larry was very much outspoken against prison rape and attempted to forbid this behavior. As I had said, Larry only saw violence as needed when completely necessary and wanted it controlled. Larry showed his absolute power in Statesville Prison on April of 1978 when he got together with members of the Black Gangster Disciples, Black Souls, Vice Lords, El Ruckins, Black P. Stones, Mickey Cobras, and organized a work stoppage strike against foul food that was being served to inmates, making them sick. During this strike, Larry Hoover also got together with leaders of several rival and allied organizations from all over the city in this prison. Now that they showed unity by assembling this work stoppage, the unity was taken further, or perhaps it was arranged while creating the stoppage in the first place. Regardless of when exactly it happened, the creation of the Folk and People Alliances happened in April of 1978, stemming from this work protest. This organizing led to another big sit-down with members of allied and enemy nations to discuss how to control the gang wars in the prison system. He proposed two rival coalitions that all major gangs would follow that could be controlled by negotiations between the leaders of each of these coalitions, just like how the Italian mafia organizes their gang wars between families. For Larry's own organization and his own allies, he assembled the Folk Alliance, which united Black Gangster Disciples, Black Disciples, Ashland Vikings, Ambrose, 2-6, Satan Disciples, Maniac Latin Disciples, Spanish Cobras, Imperial Gangsters, Latin Eagles, Simon City Royals and Insane Popes, to have complete peace among each other and work together. His rivals agreed to this and assembled their own coalition called the People Alliance. The People Alliance was assembled by the El Ruckins, Vice Lords and Latin Kings, as they allied with Latin Counts, Bishops, Mickey Cobras, Four Corner Hustlers, Insane Unknowns, Spanish Lords and Puerto Rican Stones. This became a very effective coalition in the prison system and drastically reduced violence between BGDs and BDs. Right after Larry assembled the Folk and People Alliances, he was then out of Statesville Prison and sent to Pontiac Prison in Pontiac, Illinois. When Larry got to this prison, he saw how poorly prisoners were treated by prison staff. The prison was overcrowded, and this resulted in squalid conditions. Larry Hoover organized the Brothers of the Struggle movement that involved high-ranking Black Gangster Disciples, Black Souls, Vice Lords, Black P. Stones and Mickey Cobras. These 17 inmates raised up a rebellion on July 22, 1978, to overthrow the prison and bring mass destruction. In the wake of the intense violence, 3 correctional officers were stabbed to death. When the 17 men were out on trial, they were found not guilty. During his trials that went on until 1981, he was in segregation away from other inmates initially. In the year 1978, Don Smokin Jr. Hope brought the Black Gangster Disciples to the Cabrini Green projects. The story on this began in 1978 when these men met up with Larry Hoover in Statesville. After this, Smoke got out of prison and brought BGD to Cabrini Green and introduced disciples to BGD. From the start, Smoke and Little John were bringing a larger drug trade to these projects beginning in 1978. In Cabrini Green there were just disciples as usual and were kind of cut off from all the drama that unfolded in the past 2 years. While Smoke was in with Larry, Larry asked if Smoke would become BGD and side with the Gangsters. Smoke agreed and joined BGD. Smoke then got in contact with Little John, who was on the streets of Cabrini, and now got word that Cabrini Green disciples would become BGD. This would absorb up the Black Deuces and the Blacks. This is the whole story of how the Gangster Disciples took over the majority of Cabrini Green. It all started in 1978. There was a pretty solid peace between BGD and BDs from late 1978 until late 1979, until a flare-up happened in Statesville, but got patched up only to return a year later. In late 1980 another flare-up began again and heightened on January 29, 1981, when an incident happened at Statesville. In Statesville Prison Unit B, Black Disciple gang member George Bailey resided in this unit along with members of the Black Gangster Disciples. Bailey was allowed a privileged duty known as cell house help, which allowed inmates to roam freely in the cell block without cuffs or escort by guards, according to court documents. Black Gangster Disciple leader Ernest "Smokey" Wilson disapproved of Black disciples being cell house helpers and declared that all BDs should either resign from this position or flip to becoming BGDs. Wilson even held a meeting in that unit for BGDs and BDs to attend in order to lay out the rules. 3 BDs including Bailey were in attendance, and 2 of those 3 BDs resigned from that position and listened to Wilson according to court documents, but Bailey would not drop the position. The BDs did not like this rule that Wilson imposed, and for 2 weeks straight, they chanted BD power every night around 8 p.m., according to court documents. Wilson then had a meeting with Dirk Kaplan, who as I stated earlier was a BD founder and leader. This meeting was to express Wilson's dissatisfaction of this revolt from the BDs, but apparently it got nowhere, so Wilson picked a fist fight with Bailey, which got Wilson thrown in segregation, and on January 29, he was returned back to his unit and met with fellow BGDs to plot the murder of Bailey. The BGDs obtained an aluminum bat which ended up in the hands of Fred Bobo Collins. Later on that day Collins struck Bailey in the head with a bat repeatedly, which caused Bailey to be hospitalized, and on February 5, 1981, Bailey died according to court documents, People v. Harris, 1988. After this incident in Statesville in 1981, a divide was finalized and made official for the streets as Black disciples Mickey Bull Johnson and Jerome "Shorty" Freeman were released from prison. Jerome Freeman was appointed the new chief of the entire Black Disciples organization bestowed upon him by Dirk Kaplan in 1978. Mickey Bull Johnson went to the streets to ensure all young BGDs not in the network with Larry Hoover understood that they were now Black disciples and had nothing to do with the BGDN. The BGDN alliance was finally tossed away for good and the split was completely finalized on the streets. In the same year of 1981, Black Gangster Disciples were released as well, that assured the split was finalized for the BGD side of things. Basically, there was a big toss-up in 1981 between BGD and gangs to side with either gangsters or disciples, and sections had to turn in their decision to be with the gangsters or the disciples. Either follow Larry Hoover or follow Jerome Freeman. After Barksdale's passing in 1974, he was dearly missed, especially by the gangs allied with the BGDN. Most of the disciples were also very mournful and wanted to continue growing a closer unity with the gangsters, but there was a group of disciples that didn't agree with growing closer to the gangsters and perhaps interpreted David's teachings differently. This group held grudges from the 1968 war, and now that David passed, they began to fracture away from BGDN laws and went on their own. Gangsters and most disciples that still followed BGDN were furious, and conflict began between BGD and this group of disciples. This group of rebelling disciples were some of the same ones that began conflicting with the rest of the nation as far back as 1971. In the Robert Taylor homes, Mickey Bull was advancing in rank as a top vanguard and was still running the buildings between 49th Street and 53rd Street. Especially the 5 white buildings at 51st and State and the red buildings on 49th. He was put in prison in 1973 for manslaughter charges, then was released in 1975. By the summer of 1976, he had enough power to order deeds he needed to be done. In July 1976, Todd White had stopped in the Robert Taylor's by the South State Street building. White was not known around there and was wearing fancy clothes, on top of that driving an expensive car. Mickey Bull and Thaddeus Terrell saw the man and saw an opportunity to rob White. Mickey Bull approached White while Terrell walked up and put a pistol to White's temple and told him to give them all his money. White said he had no money and Bull searched him and found nothing. Bull then grabbed the man by his necktie and dragged him across the street. White gave a wise crack saying I told you I didn't have any money. Then he twisted away and started to run. Bull was enraged, not only because the man got physical and started running, but also because he didn't have any money on him. However, Mickey didn't shoot him, instead he told Terrell to do it. Terrell then fired one shot right through White's chest. Mickey then said pop him again, make sure he's dead. After the incident, both Terrell and Johnson were picked up and charged with murder. Even though Mickey Bull was still on parole for the 1973 manslaughter, he was only given 5 years for the murder and was back out on the streets by 1977. By the year 1976, Larry Hoover wanted to reach a resolution to absolve this two-year disorganization between disciples and gangsters and continue to carry on the legacy that David Barksdale had left. All of the gangster groups agreed with Hoover. Larry had earned a lot of respect from the majority of the disciples, and they were on board to resolve the conflict and make the BGDN more than just an alliance, it would be a complete merger into one nation. This idea would bring about greater organization and complete unity, however, some disciples were dissatisfied with this idea. Again, this was the same disciples that fractured away from the BGDN after David's death and held the same grudges about the 1968 war. The new BGD Nation did become official that year, and the majority of disciples became black gangster disciples alongside the gangsters and Larry Hoover. However, the rest of the disciples led by Dirk Acklin split away entirely and brought back the name of the black disciples. This time it meant one organization and not an alliance. As soon as Dirk Acklin organized the black disciples, an immediate civil war began between BDs and BGDs that brought bloodshed on the streets. In the prison system, BGDs and BDs were at each other's throats with no resolve, and there was basically chaos everywhere. Although there was a split on the streets, there wasn't as much clarification on the difference between BGD and BD, but in prison it was very clear. Mickey Bull was incarcerated again in the late 1970s. Before Bull went into prison, he managed to convince several members of the Mickey Cobras from a 49th and State Street Robert Taylor building to become black disciples. These Mickey Cobras were known as the Fidel Castro Mickey Cobras. The building that was taken was the 4844 building. Larry Hoover showed his absolute power in Statesville Prison on April of 1978 when he got together with members of the Black Gangster Disciples, Black Souls, Vice Lords, El Ruckins, Black P. Stones, Mickey Cobras, and organized a work stoppage strike against foul food that was being served to inmates, making them sick. During this strike, Larry Hoover also got together with leaders of several rival and allied organizations from all over the city in this prison. Now that they showed unity by assembling this work stoppage, the unity was taken further, or perhaps arranged, while creating the stoppage in the first place. Regardless of when exactly it happened, the creation of the Folk and People Alliances happened in April of 1978 stemming from the protest. This organizing led to another big sit-down with members of allied and enemy nations. This was to discuss how to control the gang wars in the prison system. He proposed two rival coalitions that all major gangs would follow that could be controlled by negotiations between the leaders of each of these coalitions. This was set up the same way the Italian mafia organizes their gang wars between families. For Larry's own organization and his own allies, he assembled the Folk Alliance, which united Black Gangster Disciples, Black Disciples, Ashland Vikings, Ambrose, 2-6, Satan Disciples, Maniac Latin Disciples, Spanish Cobras, Imperial Gangsters, Latin Eagles, Simon City Royals and Insane Popes, to have complete peace among each other and work together. His rivals agreed to this and assembled their own coalition called the People Alliance. The People Alliance was assembled by the El Ruckins, Vice Lords and Latin Kings, as they allied with Latin Counts, Bishops, Mickey Cobras, Four Corner Hustlers, Insane Unknowns, Spanish Lords and Puerto Rican Stones. This became a very effective coalition in the prison system and drastically reduced violence between BGDs and BDs.
You're listening to the Everything Network.
Around this time, the Folks and People was beginning a scattered settlement of BDs on the west side of Chicago. It finally came into fruition when they settled in the Henry Horner projects. Gangs had always been active in the Horners, but never took over power and created much significant action until the late 70s. This is when the BDs became one of the Henry Horner powers. The BD's largest west side territory was in the same neighborhood. This was in the Medical District Tri-Taylor area. This was an area bounded by Monroe Street on the north, Congress Parkway on the south, Damon Avenue on the east and Western Avenue on the west. Despite Folk and People alliances, BDs clicked up with traveling Vice Lords and Four Corner Hustlers in the Austin neighborhood in later years. It is unknown exactly when BDs settled in Austin or North Lawndale at 13th and St. Louis, or at Fulton and Avers. This was the Insane Deuce BDs. The BDs have rooted themselves heavily in their west side territory and came into strength beginning in the late 70s. The Bluefin BDs settled at Central Avenue and Division Street in the Austin neighborhood in the 2000s. In the year 1978, Dirk Acklin appointed Jerome Shorty Freeman to run the Disciples because it looked like Dirk was going to end up with a life sentence. There was a pretty solid peace between BGD and the BDs. This lasted from late 1978 until late 1979, until a flare-up happened in Statesville, but got patched up, only to return a year later. In late 1980, another flare-up began and heightened on January 29, 1981, with another incident happening at the prison. In Statesville Prison, Unit B, Black Disciple gang member George Bailey resided in this unit along with members of the Black Gangster Disciples. Bailey was allowed a privileged duty known as cell house help. This allowed inmates to roam freely in the cell block without cuffs or escort by guards, according to court documents. Black Gangster Disciple leader Ernest "Smokey" Wilson disapproved of Black disciples being cell house helpers and declared that all BDs should either resign from this position or flip to becoming BGDs. Wilson even held a meeting in that unit for BGDs and BDs to attend in order to lay out the rules. 3 BDs including Bailey were in attendance, and 2 of those 3 BDs resigned from that position and listened to Wilson, according to court documents, but Bailey would not drop the position. The BDs did not like this rule that Wilson imposed, and for 2 weeks straight, they chanted BD power every night around 8 p.m., according to court documents. Wilson then had a meeting with Dirk Cacklin, who as I stated earlier was a BD founder and leader, to express Wilson's dissatisfaction of this revolt from the BDs, but apparently it got nowhere, so Wilson picked a fist fight with Bailey, which got Wilson thrown in segregation, and on January 29, he was returned back to his unit and met with fellow BGDs to plot the murder of Bailey. The BGDs obtained an aluminum bat which ended up in the hands of Fred Bobo Collins. Later on that day, Collins struck Bailey in the head with the bat repeatedly, which caused Bailey to be hospitalized, and on February 5, 1981, Bailey died according to court documents. In the year 1981, Mickey Bull was released from prison and was given a new rank as bishop, which was a very high position. Jerome Freeman was also released that same year, and Dirk Cacklin placed Freeman in charge of the Black disciples on the streets. Mickey Johnson was like a prophet. He informed all the disciples not following BGD laws that they were now part of the Black Disciple Nation that was created 5 years earlier in prison. And now the split was official on the streets. The BGDN alliance was defunct, as now there were 2 separate organizations, tied loosely by the Folk Alliance. Mickey also taught the BDs about the Folk Alliance and all the bylaws associated with it. He was also pivotal in getting the word out to Hispanic and white gangs. Mickey also taught BDs the new hand sign, which was the gates or the 3 fingers. More gang members also got released from prison that same year and began flipping members from the old BGDN into BGDs, which included many groups of disciples. Mickey Johnson made sure not all of the Stateway Gardens became BGD, and even convinced most of the Dell Vikings to flip to BDs, making the BDs have a strong presence in the Stateway Gardens. This is the story of how BDs got into the Stateway Gardens. In the year 1982, Mickey Bull and the BDs took over the long-standing Mickey Cobra buildings near 45th and State. This was the 4555 and 4525 buildings which the Cobras held since 1962. This left the Mickey Cobras with only the Hole, which was 3 buildings from 53rd and State down to 54th and State. Mickey Bull had successfully pushed the MCs south of 53rd Street. In 1982, the wars between BGDs and BDs almost came to an end. Dirk Cacklin was released from prison and disapproved of how powerful Jerome Freeman had become. Dirk then created his own group of Black disciples to go against Freeman's. This group was called the Asiatic Apostles, as a civil war began within the Black disciples. As a result of this war, relations between the BGDs and the BDs smoothed over, as these 2 Black disciples factions were less focused on removing each other, until Dirk Cacklin's BDs went back to their former Black disciples sets in 1983 or 1984. In the year 1984, Mickey Bull was promoted again to the rank of minister, which gave him his own dynasty. Being a minister was a very high rank that usually no one receives in the organization. Having a dynasty means you control an entire area of the city. Mickey's dynasty was the entire south side of Chicago, anywhere from Bronzeville down to the Wild 100s, it was all controlled by Mickey Bull. His main territory that he directly supervised daily was the Robert Taylor homes. He held BD meetings in front of the 4950 building. Bull himself allegedly stayed at 5041 South Federal Street in apartment 1505 with a woman named Brenda Ware. He ran that building and all the buildings surrounding the area. In the early and mid-1980s, relations between BDs and BGDs was at its best point, especially now that Folk Nation rules and regulations reached the streets. Now both gangs would often team up against rivals like Vice Lords, Black P. Stones and Mickey Cobras. The crack cocaine epidemic of the late 1980s caused relations between the 2 gangs to completely break down, mainly because of the crack trade in the Englewood neighborhood. Beginning in the year 1987, fierce competition and intense gang wars erupted in the high-rise public housing projects citywide. Gangs began muscling in on these buildings and also setting up their own security as they walked through the hallways armed with automatic weapons and shotguns. The gangs also patted down residents and imposed curfews. The competition was fierce. The Englewood neighborhood is Chicago's most violent and most impoverished neighborhood. Just like the high-rise housing projects, the Englewood community became a hotbed for crack cocaine users, which made distribution a large money-making commodity. The BDs had a long-rooted history in the Englewood community, as the largest piece of their story started on these streets, and they felt ownership of this neighborhood. Black P. Stones and Mickey Cobras were never welcomed by the BDs in this neighborhood, but now the BD's biggest allies, the Black Gangster Disciples, were muscling in on too many BD drug spots. The Black Gangster Disciples felt they were entitled due to being the larger organization and sitting at the top of the Folk Nation alliance. After this, the BDs felt nothing but disrespect from their BGD brethren. By 1989, tempers began to flare. Jerome Freeman would end up back in prison on a 28-year sentence for felony drug charges. Soon after, all hell broke loose on the streets of Englewood. This was the beginning of severe conflict between the Black Disciples and Black Gangster Disciples, or as you may know them, the Gangster Disciples. In the hot summer of 1991, some Gangster Disciples were ready for war with the Black Disciples, but Mickey Bull was holding relations tight between the two organizations. This was a threat to the GDs that did not want to be controlled this way. Bull was not expecting the GDs to come after him because there was no full-fledged war yet. On top of that, Mickey Bull was in a place of power and seemed untouchable, plus many of the BDs and GDs feared and respected him. Mickey was mild-mannered and charming, but he would also have no tolerance for those that crossed him. When he walked the streets he had a special whistle that the BDs knew. When Mickey whistled it meant he was summoning some soldiers for business. It didn't matter what you were doing, if you were laying in bed with the flu, if you were laying in bed with your girl, if you were taking a shit, it didn't matter, you had to stop everything and rush outside to Mickey when he whistled. He had this kind of power that enemies could not touch because he could see it coming, but in August of 1991, he never expected the GDs to come at him, but that is what happened. Members of the Gangster Disciples shot Mickey dead on the streets. This sparked an immediate and violent backlash from the Black Disciples that became legendary. The getback had to be harsh for this, and on August 7, 1991, Englewood was turned into a war zone.
You're listening to the Everything Network.
By August of 1991, during one of the hottest and driest summers in Chicago history, the feuding between the GDs and BDs was taken to a new level because of the death of Mickey Bull. On August 7, 1991, the Black Disciples murdered 3 members of the Gangster Disciples on that hot August Wednesday night. The hit was done out of a taxi cab. The BDs actually shot them from a taxi cab. This was seen as one of the craziest ways a gang could do a hit on someone at that time. The problems all started that day at 66th and Peoria, at the apartments at 6556 South Peoria Street, now torn down. Joe, a Black disciple, came pulling up in the afternoon and started taunting 3 Gangster Disciple members by throwing up the BD gang sign. One of the Gangster Disciples, Kevin Gibbs, threw up a sign and shouted BDK. Joe yelled back the letters of GDK, then someone inside the building shot at Joe as he peeled off, but stopped real quick to say he would be back later. Later that night at 11 p.m., the Gangster Disciples were back out on the street and hustling on that corner. Then, a red and white taxi cab drove up, followed by another car, as the Black Disciples were known for riding 2 cars deep on hits. Both vehicles then stopped, and one of the windows on the taxi cab rolled down, and a barrel of a gun appeared as the shooting suddenly started. All 3 Gangster Disciples were shot, but 2 of them survived, while the other died. A little while later at 618 West 71st Street, out in front of a submarine sandwich shop on 71st and Low, another shooting happened, in which 3 Gangster Disciples were shot again. 2 of them ended up dying at that corner. A taxi cab was apparently stolen to be used in this shooting as well, perhaps as a diversion. After all, who would expect a taxi to pull up and start shooting at you? After this shooting there was no love anymore between GDs and BDs, it was all-out war that would never quit. The BDs even changed their hand signs from then on. Between 1991 and 1994, the south side of Chicago was in a state of intense warfare between the GDs and BDs. Gang members from both gangs basically said you couldn't go anywhere during that time. It was not until 1994, when Marvell Thompson stepped in, after he was cleared on a murder charge, that the violence between the set settled down for a while. As the 90s progressed, more and more gangsters disciples flipped to black disciples. However, in the earlier days, there was no point on flipping from GD to BD, because both gangs were allied against Black P. Stones, Mickey Cobras and Vice Lord factions. But now there was an alternative to being a GD and still remaining folks, well, you went up against your old enemies under the People Nation. Back in the day, flipping would not help because GDs and BDs were mostly tight. Now that the war was in permanent swing, disgruntled GDs could flip to BD, and several all ties to GD, unless of course they went to prison. In January 1996, gangster disciple Governor Chuck Dorsey was shot and killed on the streets. After this happened, the GDs and BDs had a meeting at 38th and Cottage Grove in the Bronzeville area. The two sets were allies at 38th and Ellis, and all around the Ida B. Wells and Madden Park projects area. The death of Chuck could have brought more war in these section, and at the low end located at 46th and Evans, 5th Ward, in Grand Boulevard. At the meeting, Rimrod threw down the pitchfork to disrespect GDs, but there was no violence. Instead of violence, many GDs flipped to BDs at the low end and in the projects, making BD numbers stronger. Rimrod was killed shortly after the meeting, along with other high-ranking BDs, but the BDs had grown stronger at these locations. The BDs grew incredibly in the 1990s and 2000s decade as they climbed up to becoming one of the top 10 largest gangs in Chicago, with members in other states and scattered all over the suburbs. Violent gang wars erupted in the Robert Taylor and Stateway Gardens projects as gunfire echoed day and night, mainly between BDs and GDs. Both gangs exercised majority control of both public housing high complexes, and other gangs had a very small piece of these buildings. Therefore, the BDs and GDs were each other's biggest competition in these projects. The BDs showed their muscle against the larger enemy and showed relentless pursuit of violence against their foes, which gained them a massive reputation, causing many young black youths to want to join the gang as they grew to over 6,000 members. In 1991, the Black Disciples took over the 16-story high-rise Randolph Tower Housing Authority complex located in the Washington Park neighborhood, which was located at 6217 South Calumet Avenue, 63rd and Calumet. This large building, the BDs nicknamed the Castle, where they set up a complex $45,000 a day to as much as $100,000 a day crack cocaine and heroin operation in this tower. The tower was run by Marvel Thompson, and residents and anyone were searched at the front door by armed BD guards with automatic weapons and shotguns. This operation was incredibly complex as money from drug profits was even laundered and invested into an Atlanta nightclub, apartment buildings and even into the rap label. Black Disciple snipers were posted on the roof of the buildings, equipped with high-powered and complex sniper rifles. Members also wore night vision goggles at night so they could spot enemy gang members and easily pick them off. The building was not friendly to police officers, and Chicago police stayed away, especially after one incident where an undercover officer entered the building and as he was patted down, a bulletproof vest was discovered. As the officer tried to run, a BD pulled out his pistol and shot the officer in the back, but the officer survived. The BDs even became so bold that they hijacked the WCFL radio frequency. This was a frequency owned by a Christian radio station in the suburb of Morris. Once you arrived in Chicago city limits, the frequency was playing gangster rap music that was described by the Chicago Tribune. The frequency owners were shocked when they drove to Midway Airport and the music suddenly took over. The frequency was also said to be used to communicate with the tower to alert the gang of any possible threats coming. In 2004, a massive raid by the police swept through this complex as several members were arrested. In the aftermath, it was decided the best way to stop the dealings at this complex was to tear the complex down, and in 2004, the buildings were razed. The tower was the largest drug operation the Black Disciples had ever ran, but the gang would continue to grow and open new ventures elsewhere. If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, and also don't forget to click on the notification bell so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network. If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, and also don't forget to click on the notification bell so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network. Many Mexican people arriving in the United States were often ridiculed and discriminated against even by their own people that were Americanized. This is something that happened in Pilsen back in these days. Mexican youths and laborers were often bullied and robbed of the cash they carried by neighborhood gangs after they had labored all day. Eventually some of these Mexican youths on the block of 17th and Racine grew tired of being harassed. Especially by gangs like the Latin Counts, Bishops, Latin Brother, Stoneheads, Party Masters, Tokers and Latin Kings. The youths got together under the direction of Macabrio Rubin and Bones. The name La Raza was chosen along with the Mexican flag colors because La Raza was showing their pride of the country they came from and were ready to fight for those colors and name to the death. The rival gangs in the neighborhood were upset with the name and tried to take it from them, but were met with fierce resistance from the La Raza gang. La Raza tried to avoid gang activity in the early 80s and just tried to be a hangout group that protected each other, but rivals continued to harass them and La Raza had to fight back. La Raza youths tried to remain mostly law-abiding kids that hung out in Dvorak Park by Cullerton and Racine, but even playing in that park brought them harassment from the gangs fighting over that territory. In the year 1981, the fights with neighborhood gangs got worse for La Raza, and they made the decision to join the Folk Alliance alongside their closest allies the Party People. Just like the Party People, La Raza joined the Folk Alliance under the sponsorship of the Little Village 26s, but La Raza did not adopt the moniker of gangster like the Party People did. Instead La Raza adopted Insane, which was the moniker that the Satan disciples used, but La Raza had no direct ties to the SDs, except for being folks too. La Raza and Party People were close allies, since they both started in the same year of 1980 as Party Crews. Both groups also consisted of mainly Mexican youths fresh from Mexico that were struggling with gangs in the neighborhood, trying to take advantage of them. There may have been a friendship with the Brazers too as they were going through the same thing, however, La Raza was not born out of the Brazers as many think. There were also stories that La Raza was born out of the Party People. This isn't true either. Many other stories try to claim La Raza was born out of other various groups, but those are not true either. Many just seem to have a hard time grasping that La Raza started independently and have always been lone wolves that sometimes have allies. Many seem to want to believe La Raza was once owned by other gangs upon their inception, but this isn't true. La Raza is all original. In the year 1982, a younger group of La Raza started up called Tiny Raza that was situated by 21st and Throop. This was the slow progression of how La Raza was becoming more and more known in the neighborhood as they were now growing. Things got real serious in 1982 when the gang's first ever member Martin was gunned down. This is when La Raza began to gravitate more into being a gang-banging crew than ever. After the killings of Mando and Snake, then in 1984 Macabrio was killed by Racine Street Latin Counts. This made La Raza more into a hardcore gang-banging crew, as now they were targets by rivals more so than ever. In the year 1985, La Raza expanded into new territory in the back of the yards community. Beto was the founder of the 48th Street La Raza branch as he connected with a gang called the 48th Street Boys that made a lot of noise in the early 1980s. This section was started at 48th and Laughlin. La Raza was always hard for law enforcement and the general public to identify because of their name and colors. Anybody who is Mexican can wave the Mexican flag and say they are La Raza, which means the race in Spanish. If Chicago police were to harass someone based upon them claiming they are La Raza and wearing the Mexican flag colors and emblems, they could be accused of violating the civil rights of that individual. This is how the La Raza gang blended in until the late 1980s. By the mid-1980s, everyone was starting to hear about La Raza as they became more violent in their gang banging, as now members were beginning to drop rival gang members as well. Since many of these older members didn't have too many ties to the United States, they could just pack up and leave for Mexico after committing a murder. In the year 1988, La Raza went to war with Ambrose along 18th Street. In March of that year, some Ambrose members jumped a member of La Raza, and according to court documents, La Raza gang members Martin Quiroz and Jose Anaya shot and killed Ambrose gang member Jesus Sanchez. In that same year of 1988, La Raza and the Satan disciples went to war. This was mainly because La Raza was still allied to the 26s and 26s had just launched into full-scale war with Satan disciples. At Cullerton and Loomis, La Raza was always in very close proximity to allies the 22 boys, and now that 26 and 22 boys were at war and La Raza was still allied with 26, a war erupted with the 22 boys. In the late 1980s, La Raza aggressive measures grew as they continued to be implicated in more and more shootings. La Raza would often deal with their enemies quickly without any hesitation, giving them the reputation as one of the more violent street gangs in the Pilsen area and perhaps on the top list for the city. This gained them much notoriety and brought them more expansion in Pilsen, and now they progressed to growing into other neighborhoods, especially the back of the yard neighborhood between 47th and 49th Street from Ashland down to Racine, 48th side. Raza also grew into a large area in Pilsen between 19th Street and 21st Street and Loomis to Racine. At this point they likely closed 17th Street to focus more on the 19th Street zone. At some point in time Raza also opened up 50th and Hoyne in 42 Road and Mozart in Kelly Park in the Brighton Park neighborhood. Raza also spread into the Marquette Park neighborhood at 61st and Fairfield and 76th and Ridgeway in the Ashburn neighborhood. Raza even wandered into the north side and opened territory at Clark and Estes North Pole in the Rogers Park neighborhood. Raza also made their way into the Hermosa neighborhood on Chicago's northwest side at Harding and Wabancha DK Town, which became a flourishing section that spread to Cortland and Kedvale. In the earlier 1990s Raza would pioneer the suburbs of Streamwood, Rockford, Carpentersville and Cicero at 14th and 49th in the Grant Work section. By 1990, the war with Ambrose died out and would not resume until the mid-1990s. In Cicero by the early 1990s, the two boys originally were on the corner of 14th and 49th, and now over a decade later, Raza was settling there. This kicked off a major gang war, as these two gangs were just too close to each other. Raza also began to be at odds with the Satan Disciples, and all-out war began in 1988 as well. Throughout the 1990s, Raza fought several vicious and bloody gang wars, yet they continued to multiply in size and seemed to become increasingly violent. Raza remained close allies with 2-6 until a territorial dispute happened in 1998 over 42nd and Mozart, which was in 2-6 territory, and Raza was taking from their drug business. Raza did not want to give up the territory, so they both went to war for about a year. Then a truce was called because both gangs were having issues with the Saints, and Raza left that territory and put more soldiers on 48th Street for investment reasons and to keep relations with 2-6. 2-6 eventually left 61st and Fairfield, closing down their Marquette Park operations for reasons I did not know. Cortland and Kedvale was eventually left behind for more investment at Harding and Wabancha. Raza has not lost much territory over the years and only lost one suburban investment in Carpentersville because of the police. The organization has ran strong since 1972 and is known for being one of the more vicious, aggressive and violent organizations. The story of the Harrison Gents begins in the year 1957, when a group of Rican, Irish and African American boys from Harrison and Western in the near West Side neighborhood were forced to protect their neighborhood from invading gangs like the Egyptian Cobras, Taylor Street Dukes, Clovers and Imperial Chaplains. The gangs were hungry for dominance and wanted to take over this main intersection. These kids at this intersection were good kids that were well-mannered and especially were respectful to women of all ages. Basically they were well-behaved gentlemen. The problem was they were also bullied and attacked by gangs, which drove them to fight almost every day. In the year 1959, the boys decided it was time to organize into a gang, and they had no choice due to constant invasions. They decided on the name Harrison Gents because they were from Harrison Street, and the gents part came from the fact they were gentlemen to women. They chose the color purple because it was a popular zoot suit color back then. The HGs began congregating just down the block at Claremont Playlot, located at 2334 Watts. Flournoy Street, Flournoy and Western, this is where they congregated and swelled in numbers in the 1960s. The HGs eventually advanced east down to Damon Avenue and encompassed Damon Avenue to Western Avenue and Harrison Street to Flournoy. This was all just about 2 blocks away from the Taylor Street gangs and not far from the Vice Lords of North Lawndale. In the year 1964, some Rican members of the Harrison Gents migrated to the East Village neighborhood at Ashland and Beach, and this put them into direct conflict with the Latin Kings that were arriving at the same time at Ashland and Cortez during the Great Puerto Rican migration to West Town area. The Gents that arrived here also slugged it out viciously with the PVPs that became one of their arch-enemies. Ashland and Beach was the first section that came right after Harrison and Western. In the year 1964, the Harrison Gents arrived in the Uptown neighborhood at the intersection of Kenmore and Ainsley when Puerto Ricans and African American were first migrating there. This was also the first time the Gents recruited white members into the gang. Another gang that settled 1 block away was the Latin Kings. Right away the Gents and Kings were met by the Young Lords and Latin Eagle Street gangs from the nearby Lakeview neighborhood. Immediate gang brawls were breaking out between the 4 gangs. Latin Eagles and Young Lords were allies and teamed up on Kings and Gents, therefore Latin Kings and Harrison Gents became very close allies. In the midst of the war between Harrison Gents and Latin Eagles, the Latin Eagles killed the leader of the Gents, which angered the Gents. However, they did not get revenge until 1975, when they burned down the house of a Latin Eagle gang member near the intersection of Fremont and Addison. In the Wrigleyville section of the Lakeview neighborhood, a 13-year-old girl was killed in the fire, while members of the Harrison Gents were arrested. The Harrison Gents then would spread their influence into the Wicker Park neighborhood sometime in the 1960s into the Blackhawk Park area at the intersection of Ashland Avenue and Division. In this area the HGs were fighting with the Spanish Lords and some other gangs. In the year 1968, the Harrison Gents found common ground with the Ashland Vikings because of their mutual hatred for Latin Kings and PvP. This was the beginning of a very close alliance between the two gangs. The Harrison Gents would soon gain more popularity because of their ruthless ways and making the newspaper. On June 24, 1969, several members of the Harrison Gents paid a visit to the Lathrop projects on Clybourn Avenue to start problems with the young lords that were living there. The exact address this was happening was at 2852 Clybourn Avenue, which is near the intersection of Clybourn and George in the North Center neighborhood. The Young Lords were an activist group by 1969 and were no longer all about the gang banging, but the Harrison Gents had ticked them off and got them to fight. The fight was nasty and heated, and the Gents were likely getting the better of the Young Lords because when the police arrived and tried to stop it, a few officers were accidentally struck by HGs that had tunnel vision in bashing anyone in sight. The Gents tried to play nice and help the officers after hitting them, but the cops still turned around and arrested them. As the later 1960s came and the Harrison Gents expanded to the intersection of Sheridan and Leland in the Uptown neighborhood, HG numbers swelled into the hundreds between the Harrison and Western section, Wicker Park and Uptown sections. Eventually the Gents spread to Augusta and Paulina, Hermitage and Cortez, Chicago Avenue and Hermitage, Chicago Avenue and Wood and Rice and Wood, covering all over Noble Square and East Village. In the early 1970s, the Harrison Gents of West Town absorbed both Mighty Grand of Ashland and Grand Avenue and the Lazy Gents, converting them all into Harrison Gents. In the year 1979, bad blood developed between the Harrison Gents and Latin Kings in Uptown. Conflicts led to the Latin Kings killing a Harrison Gent that year, and full-fledged war began. Now the Gents from Uptown were joining their fellow Gents from West Town in a war against the Latin Kings. One of the main reasons the Gents didn't join folks in 1978 was because of the Uptown alliance with the Latin Kings, but after this incident they were open to joining folks, and in 1980, when the folk alliance opened to new gangs, the Gents got in right away. Many Harrison Gents were incarcerated by 1980, so they were approached to join the Spanish Gangster Disciple Alliance behind bars, which earned them a folk alliance offering. In the year 1981, the Harrison Gents were now folks on the streets after it was now spread to the streets that year. When the HGs joined folks, they were able to ally up tightly with fellow folks like the Insane Dragons and open territory at Augusta and Fairfield in the East Humboldt Park neighborhood. Also, in 1980 the older HGs out of Cortez and Ashland under David and an independent group of Cobras were actively hanging out with the Vikings. In that same year the V's hooked up with Erie House at 1347 West Erie Street. They were trying to form a graffiti cleanup campaign with the West Town gangs. From there, Puncher and CM, an old-school LD running a section out of the Huron and Ada territories, established a gang truce that would include the AVs, the LDs, La Familia and the TPs. Upset with an article where the YLOs tried to claim the alliance under their flag, the V's and the D's pull in the HGs and start running under their own banner, UPCI, United Patriots Creating Identity, and also wanted to run the Truce Alliance under its own flag. But Erie House wanted a name better suited to the community so that they could open lines into the Department of Neighborhoods. So as a compromise they kept the initials UPCI and added the name United People for Community Improvement. Keeping the initials UPCI allowed the older leaders to keep United Patriots Creating Identity in the streets as the true umbrella over the Gang Truce Coalition, hence the AKA and the UPCI cards. Over the next couple of months the UPCI would also include the Satan Disciples, a young section of HGs out of Bosworth and Blackhawk, a group out of Eckhart Park going under the Neutrals, who although refused to be labeled a gang, could hold their own when they had to, and periodically the involvement of some Cobras and BGDs, who were affiliated with the Vikings and LDs. Erie House started dealing directly with CM and Puncher and allowed them meetings in Erie House with the other gangs when needed. The anti-graffiti campaign was successful and led to a celebration event on the Eckhart Park field grounds in Noble Square. But it was the V's who continued to launch other projects for the communities, such as replacing vaulted sidewalks, cleaning vacant lots, coordinating food and clothes drives for the shelters, and helping Peabody School, 1444 West Augusta, on a closed campus for the kids. As a result, the Vikings got mentioned on the nightly news twice and appeared alongside Erie House on a talk show called Common Ground. In 1980, the Harrison Gents ended up taking Ashland and Cortez from the Latin Kings. In the early 1980s, the Harrison Gents took over the 412 Watts Chicago Avenue, 41 Deuce building in the Cabrini Green public housing projects. The HGs were close allies with the Black Gangster Disciples, therefore, they only had to fight it out with Mickey Cobras and the Vice Lords. Vice Lords didn't have much territory in Cabrini Green. In the year 1986, feuds began between Harrison Gents and Ashland Vikings, as a young group of Harrison Gents from Black Hawk and Paulina area were mixing it up with Vikings. This resulted in war between Vikings and these Gents. The war was not backed by the older Gents from all other sections of the city, but was the start of later conflicts between Gents and Vikings. By the year 1992, the United Latino Organization Alliance was broken up as Spanish Cobras and Latin Disciples, and the Maniac Latin Disciples went to war. There were now 3 alliances that Latin folks gangs had to choose from up north: the Maniacs with the Maniac Latin Disciples, the Insanes with the Spanish Cobras, or the Almighties with the Imperial Gangsters and Latin Eagles. The Gents chose to align with the Spanish Cobras, and they became the insane Harrison Gents. It was about this time that the Gents settled in the suburbs of Kankakee and Cicero at 25th and Central Avenue. It was just a matter of time before the Harrison Gents and the Ashland Vikings were going to explode on each other, and in 1995 war erupted once again, which prompted the Harrison Gents to withdraw from the Insane family and join the Almighty family, becoming the Almighty Harrison Gents. The conflicts that began in 1986 worsened after the familias were formed, and now the older Gents were backing up the Black Hawk and Paulina area Gents, and permanent bloody war was settled between Gents and Vikings. The war got really bad when the Harrison Gents gunned down Lord Cisco from the Vikings, then the V's got revenge by gunning down Benji G from the Harrison Gents. The Harrison Gents would eventually lose their Uptown and Wicker Park turfs due to gentrification. They also lost their satellite locations in East Humboldt Park and Albany Park due to more need in their East Village and Noble Square operations. The Cicero chapter would also eventually close down. East Village and Noble Square would live on. The Harrison Gents would remain at Harrison and Western until the area was dramatically changed due to gentrification in the 2000s. The Brazer's story starts in the 70s, on the southwest side of Chicago, at the intersection of 19th and Marshfield, in the heart of Chicago section of the Lower West Side. They were better known as Los Braceros when they formed. The Brazer name didn't come until later. The Brazers consisted of Central American youths and Mexican youths that migrated to Chicago mostly illegally. When these young men arrived, they didn't speak the best English and they worked as laborers. Many laborers carried cash on them, which is what gave them the term bracero, which means a laborer that always carries cash. Braceros also only refer to Mexican laborers, but these guys were migrants of different Hispanic nationalities. The Pilsen area was mostly Americanized Mexicans by the early 70s. Therefore, migrants were often picked on and bullied, or even beaten and robbed of their cash. The neighborhood gangs knew these young men carried cash on them, so they were often beaten on the street or harassed for money. These youths finally got sick of being harassed and beaten, so they decided to form a group to protect each other. The group decided to mock the slang name they were called in the neighborhood and make it their own. The group adopted the Mexican flag colors, mainly because of the Mexican members in the group and because of the neighborhood they lived in, even though many members were Central American. The Braceros were not a street gang, but more of a party crew that could assemble to fight alongside each other if need be. Using the Mexican flag as their colors angered neighborhood gangs, but they fought hard in the 70s to keep their identity. The Brazers tried to just function as a party crew, but they soon got into fights with neighborhood gangs like the Halsted Boys, the Morgan Deuces, the Cool Gang and Latin Kings. This dragged them into gang activity, but Brazers refused to use guns. They instead wanted to always fight with fists, because it was more honorable and tougher. They gained a lot of respect from the other gangs for this. In the year 1981, the Folk Alliance grew in size as more gangs were invited to join the Folk Nation or the People. This is when they joined the Folk Alliance alongside the Latin Stylers and the Black Gangster Disciples. The Black Gangster Disciples were the ones that directly took the Brazers right into the alliance at the same time as the Stylers. The Stylers were close allies with the Maniac Latin Disciples and brought the Brazers before the MLDs, taking the Brazers into the Maniac Alliance. It was perhaps at this point where the Brazers changed their colors to black and red. Brazer turf grew all around Chase Park as they now conquered along the boundaries of Ainsley Street on the north, Leland Avenue on the south, Beacon Street on the east and Paulina Street on the west. The 80s was perhaps their best years as they became a major force to be reckoned with in Uptown. They became an important part of the alliance, and along with the Maniac Latin Disciples, they would sometime bring hell to the Latin Kings and their allies. The Brazers' move uptown and smart leadership allowed them to make more money. Just about everyone in the crew had a vehicle during their peak. They would usually ride up, hop out the cars, and give you a beating. It was rumored that they were also funded and working for the gangster disciples during this time and gave out beatings in their name. The Brazers fought vicious gang wars with the People's Nation enemies throughout the 1980s into the 90s. They fought hard until the police and immigration cracked down on them in the mid-90s and deported many of their members. In 1996, the Brazers left Chase Park and opened operations at the intersection of Morse and Wayne in the nearby Rogers Park neighborhood because the police were on them in the Uptown neighborhood. In 1980, Los Braceros realized there was too much gunplay in Pilsen and packed up and left the area, taking more than half the gang uptown to Sunnyside and Hazel. Tarzan assumed leadership of the Brazers. Once the Braceros arrived, they changed their identity and Americanized their name more to become the Brazers. Although most Hispanic residents in Uptown were Rican, the Brazers scooped up mainly Mexican youths they found in the neighborhood as they made their way to Chase Park and left Sunnyside and Hazel. In this area, the Brazers encountered the Latin Kings. They also got into it with the Gaylords, Kenmore boys and vice lords in the neighborhood as well. While encountering these enemies, the Brazers found other neighborhood gangs that had the same enemies in common, especially the Latin Stylers, Simon City Royals and the Black Gangster Disciples. At some point the Brazers went to war with fellow folks, the Spanish Cobras and Ashland Vikings. The Brazers eventually withdrew from Morse and Wayne, but possibly not until the 2010s decade. They may still be active the area. The Ashland Vikings story begins in the year 1963 on the borderline of the East Village and Noble Square neighborhood. When Puerto Rican migration first came to this area in 1963, there was an immediate flare-up of street gangs appearing in the surrounding neighborhoods. In that year of 1963, a group of boys that lived in the area got together and played football on the grounds of Wells High School at 936 Ashland and Walton. Therefore, the earliest Viking history was not about gangs, it was only about hanging out. The Viking name did not even exist yet. It was not until 1965 that the Viking name first appeared. The teens now had a good football team and needed a name. The Ashland Vikings name was voted in over the Ashland Pirates for the name of their football team. The boys, who were also now into girls and partying, opened their first clubhouse in a basement at 921 N Ashland, just off the corner of Ashland and Walton Street. By 1967, the Ashland Viking football team were getting noticed by the surrounding street gangs. Latin Kings would patrol down Ashland Avenue toward Walton Street and see the group of kids hanging out and start trouble with them. The Latin Kings were mainly out on patrol looking for playboys to fight with, but would either catch the football team before or after they fought the playboys and cause trouble with them too. On other days, playboys would patrol down Ashland looking for trouble with Latin Kings, and along the way they would see the football team and go after them, since they were a group of Puerto Rican kids. Then on some days it was even worse when playboys and Latin Kings clashed and they each patrolled down Ashland and each of them ran down the Vikings football team. In the beginning, the football team had to run from these gangs because they didn't have the resources playboys and Latin Kings had. The Latin Kings began to take aggressive measures to recruit these teens into their gang, but as the boys resisted and refused to join, the LKs began to cause more and more trouble with the team until the team's leader, called Puncher, decided it was enough and converted the Ashland Viking football team into the Ashland Viking Street Gang. The Latin Kings and Playboys would become the Vikings' first arch-enemies. Viking territory would be from Walton to Fry St. and from Ashland to Greenview Street in the Noble Square neighborhood. As a new gang, the Vikings fought in low-profile tactics which often gave them the advantage as they battled the senior Latin Kings and the PVPs, Pulaski Venture Playboys, out of the East Village neighborhood. Among the arsenal the Vikings would use were Molotov cocktails and homemade shotguns. As the Vikings' reputation grew, so did their territory, and Puncher was now being called the Fist of the North. This section out of Ashland and Walton would eventually be known as the Fist and be the first of 8 sections that would develop over time to eventually create the 8-point Raza star. The newly formed Vikings wore light green sweaters with a dark green band wrapped around the upper left arm. The president's sweater was a little different with 3 thin stripes on the upper left arm. Legend had it that the Vikings started as a Polish gang, not true, instead the real truth is they were a Puerto Rican gang that had 3 white members that weren't even Polish, but still, they were original members and considered true brothers within the group. By 1968, it became much tougher for the Vikings to continue using low-key tactics as their brawls with the Kings intensified. They fought viciously for their turf and were now being recognized by outside gangs. In 1969, after the Ashland Vikings had completely secured their territories, which were now from Augusta to Chicago Avenue and from Ashland to Noble Street, they adopted green and black as the official colors for their sweaters. Also, in that year the Vikings realized a group of Harrison Gents out of Beach and Ashland in Wicker Park were also at war with the Latin Kings. This created a mutual connection and partnership between the Vikings and the Gents, as they had one thing in common, which was ridding the Kings out of West Town. In 1970, Puncher moved the clubhouse to the attic of an 8-unit building owned by his father at 845 N Ashland, intersecting with Pearson Street, which was still within their territories in Noble Square. It was also during a period which some members of other groups such as the HGs, LKs and Warlords were joining the Vikings, members that would become true Vikings to the end. Also, during the early 70s the Vikings went into having some rather complex operations. As they became older, they were able to invest in their own businesses and began to operate as an organized crime group, owning some properties which included 2 storefronts that masked illegal activities. In the basement of an arcade they owned, vetted members would meet to discuss business and plan out certain operations. They were highly respected in their community because instead of extortion they operated in a favor-for-favor exchange. They protected the neighborhood and in return the neighborhood provided safe houses and storage places for illegal contraband when needed. Hence their early reputation as mobsters. Also, at that time the LSD coalition had fractured, and vice lords and black gangster disciples were in heavier turmoil than ever. This caused the BGDs to make connections with white and Hispanic gangs, outside of their usual turf. As for their connection with the Vikings, it started as a business deal involving drugs and firearms, however, it would eventually lead to a more shrouded relationship, as they started preforming personal and secretive hits for each other, in order to evade any trace back by law enforcement. In 1974, the Vikings fell into misfortune when their members were traced to the notorious Belmont Harbor murders, involving an armed robbery scheme that went wrong and resulted in the brutal murders of 2 women. Police interrogations tripped some members up, causing the police to uncover and move in on other Viking operations. With some members going to jail and others fleeing to Puerto Rico, their businesses fell apart and their numbers dwindled. In 1975, the Vikings' relations with the BGDs became inactive, as both groups were now dealing with other problems on their own side of the city. In 1976, Puncher revitalized the organization with a new section of Vikings on Walton Street. Among the new recruits came young blood. Puncher saw lots of potential in young blood and the possibilities to maybe someday make him a prince. This new section of Vikings became known as the Sons. The Sons would be the second point on the future 8-point star. In 1977, the Vikings were reorganizing very well and even revitalized their connections with the BGDs. In that year Larry Hoover officially recognized the Ashland Vikings as allies with the BGDs, and in April 1978, the Ashland Vikings were among the first groups invited to join the Folk Nation Alliance due to their history with the BGDs. In 1979, the Vikings made a connection with the Spanish Cobras and the Latin Disciples through young blood. This brought about the formation of the 3rd section for the Vikings under Maniac Ashland Vikings in the spring of 1979. It was also in that year that the SCs and LDs created a friendly divide, establishing the Maniacs and the Insane for their allies. This divide was not like the hard divide that happened in 1992. But as for the affiliation between the Vikings and the YLO, Young Latino Organization, it was the Cobras that made the true connection with the Vikings, and now with this new divide the Cobras that were hanging out with the Vikings wanted the section of Maniac Ashland Vikings to turn insane. But Puncher wanted to keep his Maniac section, so he opened up a new section under Insane Ashland Vikings, reinforcing their alignment with the Spanish Cobras. This new section came in at the end of 1979. The Maniac and Insane sections of 1979 would become 2 more points of the eventual 8-point star. Also, in 1979 Puncher would officially title Young Blood as the Chosen Prince and open a major recruiting drive for additional sections. In 1980, the recruiting campaign would bring in 4 more sections. The first of the 4 in early 1980 was called the Barbarians, which would become the 5th point on the later 8-point star. A little later in the year the 6th point was opened and called the Chosen. The 7th point came in towards the end of that summer, known as the PVs. The final point of the star, becoming the 8th section, was opened towards the end of that fall, known as the Young Vs. Now that there were 8 sections, the founder created a unit called the Raja Brachianas, which was made up of officers from the 8 sections. The founder personally oversaw this commission, while Prince Youngblood was appointed to lead the Rajas. Puncher then created and named the 8-point Raja Star, which not only represented his 8 sections, it gave them independence from the bylaws of the 6-point star, while also allowing them to still be allies and part of the Folk Nation. As far as females went, only 4 sections had girls. The Fist always had girls that participated in the club. But it was in 1978 that they were officially named the Matriarch Vikings. The Sons and Maniacs by 1981 had Ashland Vikings, and in 1982 the Barbarians also had Ashland Vikings. However, only the girls in the first section of the Fist were called Matriarch Vikings. The combination of the Vikings and the Young Vs were vitally important, as they could easily and together slip into rival territories to surveillance hostile grounds and bring back critical information for the missions of the Rajas. Also, in 1980 the older HGs out of Cortez and Ashland under David and an independent group of Cobras were actively hanging out with the Vikings. In that same year the V's hooked up with Erie House at 1347 West Erie Street, who were trying to form a graffiti cleanup campaign with the West Town gangs. From their Puncher and CM, an old school LD running a section out of the Huron and Ada territories, established a gang truce that would include the AVs, the LDs, La Familia and the TPs. Upset with an article where the YLOs tried to claim the alliance under their flag, the Vs and the Ds pull in the HGs and start running under their own banner, UPCI, United Patriots Creating Identity, and also wanted to run the Truce Alliance under its own flag. But Erie House wanted a name better suited to the community so that they could open lines into the Department of Neighborhoods. So as a compromise they kept the initials UPCI and added the name United People for community improvement. Keeping the initials UPCI allowed the older leaders to keep United Patriots Creating Identity in the streets as the true umbrella over the Gang Truce Coalition, hence the AKA in the UPCI cards. Over the next couple of months the UPCI would also include the Satan Disciples, a young section of HGs out of Bosworth and Blackhawk, a group out of Eckhart Park going under the Neutrals who, although refused to be labeled a gang, could hold their own when they had to, and periodically the involvement of some Cobras and BGDs who were affiliated with the Vikings and LDs. Erie House started dealing directly with CM and Puncher and allowed them meetings in Erie House with the other gangs when needed. The anti-graffiti campaign was successful and led to a celebration event on the Eckhart Park field grounds in Noble Square. But it was the V's who continued to launch other projects for the communities, such as replacing vaulted sidewalks, cleaning vacant lots, coordinating food and clothes drives for the shelters, and helping Peabody School on closed campus for the kids. As a result, the Vikings got mentioned on the nightly news a couple of times and appeared alongside Erie House on a talk show called Common Ground. In November of that year the YLO and UPCI got invited to speak at the Latino Action Coalition convention held at Roberto Clemente High School, 1147 North Western Avenue, on issues of police discrimination. The UPCI was now slipping into a political arena and the Vikings into the roles of community activist. As many of the Cortez gents are older and raising families by 1983, their section eventually dismantles, leaving Cortez to their younger members, who are now not part of the UPCI. Also by now tensions are starting to build as the LDs that run Huron Street continue to get embroiled with the SDs over their turf rules. As a result of the SDs and LDs internal conflicts, the SDs are no longer attending the meetings at Erie House. The Satan Disciples and the Vikings now start bumping heads as the Vikings make it clear that they side with the Latin Disciples. At the end of 1983, the SDs get into an altercation with one of the younger Viking sections. When the Razas receive the news, the SDs are confronted by Puncher in back of Carpenter School at 1250 West Erie, which resulted in the spokesman for the SDs getting shot. The Bosworth Gents and the Milwaukee Kings, who were not happy with the UPCI's territorial control, side with the SDs, and as 1984 rolled in the Vikings, took the SDs, HGs and MKs to war. During that war some gents would take a neutral stance as they were not in favor of the Bosworth gents and considered the true war was between the Vikings and the Satan Disciples. In 1985, the UPCI is starting to crumble as the LDs and the BGDs are the next to drop out of the affiliated group's umbrella. As the war intensifies, the SD faction, the MKS and the HGs with no real leadership, continue to struggle with the Vikings' 8 sections and their special unit of Razas. By strategically pacing themselves and using small units, the Vikings for the most part evaded the law, endured minimal casualties, and always caught the rivals off guard. By 1986, the MKs are no longer in the picture. The HGs can no longer stand the raids by the AVs and abandon assisting the SDs. The remaining SDs, which are now also engaged in skirmishes with the LDs, basically become scarcely seen on the streets, bringing the war with the Vikings to an end. A couple of murders pointing in the direction of the Vikings was something that the UPCI could not survive, bringing down with it the end of the Vikings UPCI, along with their inside connections. In 1987, the Satan Disciples regrouped and now saw the abandonment of the Harrison Gents as desertion and a personal disrespect to them. They now with a new grudge took the HGs and the MKs to war. During a calm period in the fall of 1988, when the Vikings were not engaged in any conflicts, Puncher the Chief grants control over to Prince Youngblood, and in 1992, the Chief comes together with the Prince and combines all sections of Ashland Vikings as one unit under the umbrella of the Cobra's insane familia, ending the first era of the Ashland Vikings and the beginning of a new one under the rule of Prince Youngblood. The SDs, Satan Disciples, started in the year 1959 by King Satan at the street corner of 15th and Talman in the North Lawndale neighborhood on Chicago's west side. They started on the east side of Douglas Park, which was not a major African American neighborhood at that time. The vast majority of North Lawndale was African American by 1959, but the last of the white element was east of the park. The Satan Disciples was founded mainly by Czechoslovakian and Polish white males. They also took in Mexican youths that made up about half the gang. In the year 1960, the Satan Disciples had already expanded their turf into the heart of Chicago's Lower West Side at 18th and California and Douglas Park, along with 14th and Washtenaw in the North Lawndale area. The original SDs fought against gangs like the Gaylords at 18th and Western, the Ambrose Gang at 18th and Throop, or the Latin Counts from 18th Street and Loomis. The Latin Kings did not have any territory or any foothold in any of the SD sections back in the earliest years of the SD's existence. Therefore, the television show Gangland was not very accurate about the Satan Disciples being formed because of the Latin Kings. This is false. The Latin Kings were not the number one reason for Satan Disciples coming together. There were larger threats from Ambrose, the Latin Counts and the Vice Lords that were much closer to Satan Disciples' territory. By 1964, Latin Kings began pushing their way into the Pilsen and Little Village neighborhoods. The Latin Kings wanted 18th Street in Pilsen and 26th Street in Little Village. This did not fly well with the gangs that had already been there. The Kings were able to set up massive territory along 26th Street, but 18th Street proved to be a major challenge for them, and that is partially credited to the Satan Disciples that held it down at 18th and California. They would eventually spread to 18th and Rockwell in the North Lawndale neighborhood to further solidify their presence and keep Latin Kings out. The Latin Kings still were able to secure territory from 21st through 31st, all through Pilsen and Little Village, but the Satan Disciples made it very hard for Kings to exist there until they turned the Coulter Counts into Coulter Kings in the late 60s, but that was all that the Latin Kings could settle in Pilsen. By 1966, the Satan Disciples had now began the 18th and Oakley chapter. The original Satan Disciples were fairly well-mannered and well-dressed and even had their own band. The only time they were not well-mannered is when they faced their enemies, and that was when the horns would come out. Speaking of horns, the idea for the baby devil with horns with pitchfork came from old comic books gang members used to read. Therefore, that was their new symbols along with an intimating name. The SDs remained a very small fighting club in the 1960s, but managed to keep all their turf except 14th and Washtenaw, but that is because efforts were needed more on 18th Street, and because that neighborhood was changing racially, which is what caused the original chapter at 15th and Tallman to close. They did lose some numbers in the later 1960s due to some members getting drafted or enlisting to serve in the Vietnam War. However, those members were replaced by younger Mexican youths, but it still stunted the SD's ability to grow larger at the time. In the year 1967, the Satan Disciples may have had slower growth for a short time on 18th due to the war, but now new territory was opened at 24th and Washtenaw when Big Aggie and Little Aggie arrived in this Marshall Square neighborhood. This would become a legendary chapter that would eventually spread up and down 24th Street between California Avenue and Western Avenue. The biggest 24th sections would become 24th and Washtenaw and 24th and Rockwell. At 24th and California, Satan Disciples and Latin Kings would clash for many years as both groups claimed this territory. At the 24th Street territory, SDs also fought the Artistics and Morgan Deuces, then later they fought 2-6, the Kents and Cullerton Deuces by the 1970s. In 1971 or 1972, King Satan was no longer the leader and King Canary took over leadership of the gang. It was in the early 1970s when a Satan Disciple named Kingfish flipped to become a Gaylord. After he flipped, he convinced many white original Satan Disciples to become Gaylords, and this began the 18th and Western Gaylords. These Gaylords started because they felt threatened with the neighborhood becoming majority Mexican. As the 1970s progressed, Pilsen and Little Village became more and more gang-infested, and the gangs became more violent. The drug trade also became a larger phenomenon once the heroin trade began on the streets by 1970. Some of the older SDs got into the drug trade, but it was not rampant at all in the organization at the time, or really in any of the organizations back then, but it was present. The Ambrose Gang and Latin Counts were gunning for complete control of Pilsen, while Latin Kings were trying to dominate Little Village entirely. Satan Disciples viciously fought all these gangs. They even battled it out with the 2-6 gang when they first started in 1972. In about 1975, the Satan Disciples opened new turf on the northern part of Chicago in the southern part of the West Town neighborhood. After the Gaylords left the area in the mid-1970s, the Satan Disciples were just moving in around Erie and Wood and Huron and Ashland areas. In this area, they fought viciously with the Latin Kings in the area just like back in the Pilsen area and Little Village. They would also clash with the C-Notes. In '78, a significant amount of Satan Disciples were now locked up in prison, including some key original members. In April 1978, the Folk and People Nation alliances were created in Statesville Prison in a meeting directed by Larry Hoover, who was the leader of the Black Gangster Disciples. The purpose of this alliance was to organize the gang wars in prison and perhaps the streets. Hoover and David Barksdale had allied themselves with the white and Latino gangs throughout the 1970s. They would aid them in their wars with the vice lords. It was rumored that the Satan disciples first encountered Barksdale's black disciples back in the 60s, and friendship was established immediately, especially since vice lords were trying to conquer everything on the west side of Douglas Park and North Lawndale. A pre-existing relationship between BGDs and BDs made for a smooth transition into the Folk Nation alliance. The SDs reluctantly unified with the 2-6s and the Ambrose gang, who also joined the Folk Nation, which brought these gangs together, not only in prison, but out on the streets as well. Before this, SDs deeply hated Ambrose and were arch enemies back in the 60s and at least a good part of the 70s, especially after the leader of the Ambrose gang, Luis Lima, shot Mark Rodriguez in the leg. He also shot Fidel Perez at the corner of 16th and Fairfield in the North Lawndale neighborhood on October 19, 1974. Sometime after this shooting, and maybe not until the Folk Nation was formed, were Ambrose and SD's allies, but definitely by the time both gangs were folks in April 1978, they became allies in the streets. Right after the SDs joined the Folk Nation, the first written constitution was drafted, thanks in part to the influence of the BGDs. The Satan disciples would now operate with bylaws to follow that laid out the proper conduct that all members must abide by. The biggest benefit of the bylaws was it permitted free enterprise, so that all members were allowed at any point in time to open legal businesses, just like how the Chicago outfit did it since the 1910s. This was definitely a major perk to being a Satan disciple. In the late 1970s, SDs opened their first piece of South Side territory outside of the Little Village and North Lawndale area at 42nd and Campbell in the Brighton Park neighborhood. From here, the Satan disciples opened more territory in Brighton Park and neighboring Gage Park and the back of the Yards Canaryville and McKinley Park neighborhoods in the late 1970s and early 80s. In the year 1980, they allied with the Ashland Vikings and Harrison Gents in their West Town section, right at the time when the UPCI was formed. This tightened up their relations with other folks in the area. In 1980 or 1981, King Canary was no longer the leader of the SDs. Agapito King Aggie Villalobos stepped into that role. I do not know what happened to King Canary, but he was no longer in charge by 1981 is all I know. Under King Aggie, the Satan disciples opened up new territory throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s in other parts of the city, Chicagoland suburbs and other states as membership swelled into the thousands. King Aggie was able to run the organization, even after he was incarcerated in 1983, for armed robbery. The Satan disciples had now opened several more sections in the heart of Chicago neighborhood and several more in Little Village. Just a quick note. I'm referring to Satan disciples hoods along 18th Street, as in the heart of Chicago neighborhood, and not in Pilsen. The truth is the Lower West Side neighborhood is divided in two sections, one is Pilsen and the other is heart of Chicago, but most people just call all of it Pilsen, which is why the SDs are often considered to be a Pilsen gang. I can respect the fact that the SDs can be considered a Pilsen gang, but being as technical as I am, the heart of Chicago neighborhood is where SD's turf is in this vicinity. The heart of Chicago consists of these boundaries: Western Avenue to Ashland, Blue Island Avenue to 16th Street, while Pilsen is Ashland Avenue to Halsted Street and Cermak Road to 16th Street. With that being said, the Satan disciples pretty much dominated the heart of Chicago neighborhood by the 1980s and even presently. Or you can say West Pilsen is mostly all run by SDs and has been ever since the Gaylords and Stone Kents left the area. Many of Pilsen gangs have tried to conquer turf west of Ashland Avenue, but are often met with bullets and beatings. This caused them to determine that their conquest just was not worth the cost. The only gang that was ever able to contend west of Ashland in this area of 18th Street were the Bishops. In the 1980s and first half of the 1990s, the SDs had spread into many Chicagoland suburbs, especially the suburb of Cicero in 1992. Bobby D and Wacko D brought the SDs to Cicero in '92. They opened up in Westmont, Downers Grove, Aurora, Bridgeview, Waukegan, West Chicago, Rockford, Kankakee, Calumet City, Berwyn, and Blue Island, just to name some. The Downers Grove, Westmont, and Romeoville suburbs only lasted from about 1987 to 1993, but for the many others listed went strong for a while, and some are still going strong today. It was at this point in time when the SDs started to make new enemies due to colonizing other neighborhoods, enemies such as the Saints, Noble Knights, 12th Street Players, TAP Boys and more Vice Lord factions. In the year 1988, the Satan Disciples converted a portion of a Bridgeport neighborhood gang called the Mighty Projects into Satan Disciples. This brought the SDs into the Bridgeport Homes Projects. Also in 1988, the Satan Disciples went to war with some of their fellow Folk Nation allies. This started a full-scale war that erupted with the 2-6s in the early part of the year. Beginning in 1982, the Satan Disciples and 2-6s were having tension between the two organizations. By 1988 both organizations erupted into an intense gang war after a series of shootings. One such shooting happened on February 29, 1988, when 4 Satan Disciples fired shots at 2-6 gang members playing basketball at Pershing and St. Louis, in the Brighton Park neighborhood. One member was killed. One of the intended targets was a 2-6 leader according to court documents. Shortly after this war erupted, Satan Disciples went to war with 2-6 allies such as the Party People, La Raza, Sin City Boys and Latin Souls. The Satan Disciples were also having intense rivalries with other folks in West Town as their relationships with Harrison Gents and Ashland Vikings disintegrated. In the early 1990s, as the Satan Disciples grew in size and colonized more territory, they found themselves at war with more fellow Folk Nation gangs, like the Ambrose Gang, the 2-2 Boys, and the Crazy Get Down Boys. In the mid-1990s the SDs went to war with the Harrison Gents, C Notes and Milwaukee Kings. In 1995 King Aggie was released from prison, but he soon found he was not embraced by all of the SDs. Many SDs told King Aggie that he should not be the leader and that they wanted second-in-command Danny Valencia to run the Satan Disciples as the new king. In November of 1995, Danny Valencia was shot and killed. It was said that his own gang killed him, more specifically King Aggie's supporters. The hit was allegedly ordered by King Aggie himself. After that the Satan Disciples never had another king. As the 1990s progressed the SDs had grown into several thousands of members, becoming one of the largest street gangs in Chicago. Over time some sections would pop up while others would close down. The reason for the closure of certain sections was due to decisions to withdraw if an area was not profitable enough or if police presence was too strong. The SDs often function in a very organized crime manner and would only leave a turf if it was more profitable to invest more in another area. Using smart business sense they had expanded their profits, opened several legit businesses, retained original territory and opened new turf. They eventually would grow to have almost 10,000 members. If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel and also don't forget to click on the notification bell so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network. If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel and also don't forget to click on the notification bell so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network. The history of the Black Gangster New Breeds LLS has been on the internet on various websites for many years, and most of it is all the same that the gang was formed in approximately 1978 by George Booney Black Davis while he was incarcerated because he was angry with the BGDN. This story can be told in a few parts that later converge. The first part of the story starts out on the west side of Chicago in the Abla housing projects, the Village. I don't know all the details, but what I can say is at some point in time George Booney Black Davis was a gangster that lived in these buildings that was said to be a hustler and even a killer. Davis was what is known as a goon, which tends to refer to someone that will inflict pain or kill for money. Davis was large-sized, so he was ideal for the job of cracking skulls for money. At some point in time George Davis assembled his own crew of killers called the Goon Squad Gangsters. I'm not sure when the Goon Squad Gangsters were created, but I know it existed in the 1960s, but I wouldn't be surprised if it all started in the 1950s. At some point in the 1960s the Goon Squad Gangsters set up operations in the Harold Ickes projects in the South Loop neighborhood. The Goon Squad in both areas were drug dealers before other organizations were even in the drug game deeply. The Goons in the Ickes joined the Black Gangster Disciple Alliance with direct ties to David Barksdale and the Devil's Disciples. I don't think the goons in Abla were with the disciples though, since there really were no disciples out there, and that was the section Booney directly oversaw. The next part of this story begins in the year 1972 in Statesville Maximum Security Prison in Crest Hill, Illinois. An inmate by the name of Julius Davis joined in with a semi-religious group called the Cosmos, which happened to be a group of Chicago gang members from the west side of Chicago. It is unsure what gang Julius Davis was a member of, but he organized the men to create their own crime syndicate that would become the Royal Family. Members of this group were in street gangs like Black Gangster Disciples and Vice Lords, and they were some of the most hardcore gang members of these gangs that set aside their rivalry to be a part of the Royal Family. One of the prominent members was Maurice, better known as King Baldy. The men that joined the Royal Family were scheduled to be released from prison in 1972, and they planned on coming together once released and going on a crime spree and letting nothing get in their way. In April of 1972, the Royal Family gang members were released from prison, including the 24-year-old leader Julius Davis. Davis made the first move for the royal family as he targeted the Tally Ho restaurant at 1513 Chicago Avenue in the suburb of Evanston. Davis had worked there for only 1 week in June of 1972 until he was fired. Now the following week on June 16, 1972, Davis, Teddy Candler and one other burst into the restaurant as it closed wildly wielding kitchen knives, demanding money from patrons and the restaurant owner. The three men tied up two patrons while they escorted the owner, assistant manager and the assistant manager's relative into the office to open the safe. When there was some refusal to open the safe, the men reacted violently and stabbed the owner in the chest and 3 times in the back. Then they stabbed the assistant manager twice in the back, killing them both. Candler and Davis did not wear masks or gloves and made off with $300. Police very easily tracked down Candler and arrested him. Police went searching for Julius Davis because they had a positive identification from witnesses. This angered the rest of the royal family because Davis was reckless and did not use a mask or gloves, and the robbery was very sloppy. The royal family then made the decision to eliminate their leader-founder and managed to hunt him down before police could find him. On June 19, 1972, police found the burned body of Julius Davis as he had also been shot 7 times and left at 3748 South Wabash, 37th Place and Wabash, in the Grand Boulevard neighborhood of Chicago. At the time, police did not know that Davis was killed by his own gang, but later on they would find out all about the royal family and the motive for the murder. The rampage of the royal family had just begun. Now that Davis was eliminated, Roger Collins took over as the new leader of the royal family. Collins would gain much more respect and was considered the godfather of the organization and presided over the Council of War. Collins wanted his organization to function more like a syndicate with a distribution of drugs, murder for hire, robbery and intimidation and elimination of witnesses. Collins connected with the Chicago outfit back in 1971 when he was in prison with Robert "Fat Man" Cruz and royal family member Murray Hooper. Cruz was an excellent connection because he was the cousin of Harry Ailman, who was the Chicago outfit's chief hitman, and Cruz was also the nephew of Joseph Joe Nagel Ferriola, the chief enforcer of the Chicago outfit. This connection would bring the royal family murder for hire contracts to kill for the Chicago outfit and later would connect the royal family to the outfit for narcotics trafficking. The royal family had no tolerance for witnesses and dealt with them in a brutal way. The first example of this was in May of 1972, right before the Tally Ho heist. On May 17, 1972, 3 royal family members held up a tavern in the Auburn Gresham neighborhood at 505 West 79th Street, 79th and Normal. The next day the royal family felt that the bartender Joseph Murphy might be able to identify them, so 5 members of the gang went into the tavern on May 19 and lit up Murphy in a hail of gunfire as the bartender was brutally shot 10 times. Anthony Holmes, one of the members, was charged with the murder. On June 14, 1972, right before the Tally Ho holdup, Roger Collins and Richard Black robbed 2 customers and 3 employees at the Morseview Drug Store at 1448 West Morse Avenue, Greenview and Morse, in the Rogers Park neighborhood. The men made off with $939, but police soon caught up with them near Lakeshore Drive, where they crashed their car during a high-speed chase. Black and Collins were now in court for this case for months. Then on September 13, 1972, a man visited witness Sidney Frankfurt and said he was Collins, and Black's lawyer tried to convince Frankfurt not to testify and showed pictures of Frankfurt and other employees. The incident was chilling, but Frankfurt still wanted to testify. On October 29, 1972, men burst into the drug store and kidnapped Frankfurt and his cashier Mrs. Ann Barton. The 2 were stuffed into a truck and driven to 57th and LaSalle in the Washington Park neighborhood. Then the 2 were shot and killed. Then the car was set on fire. The royal family did not appreciate witnesses to their drug trafficking activities. The royal family had even established connections within the Chicago Police Department by 1972. Maurice King Boldy Jackson had come across information that Harold Bush was informing police of the royal family's drug trafficking operations. Jackson and police officer Chester Thomas kidnapped Harold Bush from the intersection of 14th and Western Avenue and drove him to 130th and Indiana onto a secluded dirt road in the Riverdale neighborhood. The men shot Bush in the neck and left him, but Bush survived and implicated the 2. Both Jackson and Thomas were arrested for attempted murder, and Officer Thomas was being implicated in an August 19, 1972 triple murder, where a witness saw Thomas's license plates pull away from the scene of the crime at 1646 South Pulaski, 18th Place and Pulaski, in the North Lawndale neighborhood. Maurice Jackson was implicated in another royal family murder in October of 1973 after police arrested royal family members Marvin Duncan and Fred Weaver, and they found the wallet and identification of Darnell Carr, who had just been bound, gagged and brutally beaten to death at 9147 South Ashland Avenue, 92nd and Ashland, in the Burnside neighborhood. Weaver told police Maurice Jackson ordered this murder gang would continue their rampage. On July 5, 1973, Walter Wilbon, Leroy Williams and Jeffrey Bowen robbed Judy's Lounge at 2852 East 87th Street in the South Chicago neighborhood. When Officer Randall came to the scene, the men shot him and they fled. The officer survived and all 3 royal family members were convicted. In 1974, royal family gang member John Miles went on a major armed robbery spree as he was arrested for 10 or more armed robberies, one that resulted in him shooting a store clerk in the back. The royal family was robbing and killing all across the country and had major drug operations on the south side and west side, as they were implicated in as many as 30 murders across the country between 1972 and 1974. Anyone that was a state's witness would either be intimidated or killed. One such incident was an undertaker that was present during one of the royal family's armed robberies and wanted to cooperate as a witness. The witness was in fear for his life, and police offered protection by having police guards present at his funeral home. One night, the royal family dug up one of the bodies from the nearby grave and threw it through the window of the funeral parlor office to intimidate the witness after midnight that night. This was a show of power and intimidation. By the summer of 1974, police cracked down hard on the royal family and made 13 arrests of members of the gang. The police had implicated that Roger Cochise Collins was the leader of the gang, and the gang had drug operations in Chicago and Gary, Indiana. Members of the gang were brought up on trial for various crimes, but sentences that were handed down were extremely light, as members only got a few years apiece. However, police were able to boast that they dissolved the gang's operations, as they stated in the August 24, 1974 Tribune article. At some point in 1972, Roger Collins came into contact with George Davis, and the Royals family connected with the Goon Squad Gangsters as partners, and this is how Booney and Cochise came together. I'm not sure where Thomas Jeepers Jefferson comes in, but he was much older than all of them. Jeepers was born in 1922 and was already 50 years old in 1972, but was somehow tied in and eventually became a leader in the overall organization. In 1977 through 1979, many royal family members were being released from prison for their part in the 1972 to 1974 crime spree. Members of the gang went back to work by March of 1979. That started with the murder of Donald Curtis, the owner of the Blinking Cat Lounge, located at 87th and Peoria in the Auburn Gresham neighborhood, as they robbed the bar and gunned down the owner with semi-automatic weapons on March 31, 1979. On May 7, 1979, the gang stormed Metropolitan Insurance Company in the Auburn Gresham neighborhood, located at 9046 South Ashland Avenue, 91st and Ashland, where they robbed the place at gunpoint, and they fired several bullets near witnesses to scare them and made off with $19,000. On August 7, 1979, also in the Auburn Gresham neighborhood, the gang hit Concord gas station located at 440 West 87th Street, 87th and Eggleston. Police arrested the men and found a cache of weapons that included a shotgun and a semi-automatic carbine. On August 27, 1979, Roger Cochise Collins was released from prison and immediately went to work putting the royal family back together as he reunited with paroled gang members. Once Cochise was out of prison, he was immediately given a murder-for-hire contract. The ex-husband of Catherine Tynes hired Collins, Maurice Powell and the nephew of Collins to kill Catherine Tynes because they were having a property dispute. Maurice Powell was the ringleader of the robberies early in the year while Collins was still in prison, and now Collins was back in charge and him and Powell now carried out this contract. Police were frustrated that the royal family was back at it again and were even more furious all these men received parole. By December of 1979, Roger Collins had set up a drug ring at 2240 South State Street, which is within the Harold Ickes projects located in the near South Side neighborhood. This brought about gang wars with the black gangster disciples that were trying to control the drug trade in these projects that became bloody by 1980. On the night of November 12, 1980, the drug disputes with rival dealers in the Ickes projects escalated when Murray Hooper, Maurice Pimp Powell and Roger Collins kidnapped Frederick Lacey, R.C. Pettigrew and Roger Holloman as they rounded the men up at an apartment at 2240 State Street. The 3 men were tied up and led to a vehicle then driven to the intersection of Roosevelt and Clark in the South Loop area and brought under the viaduct. Frederick Lacey was shot execution style in the back of the head. R.C. Pettigrew was shot in the face, in the chest and in the leg and was also shot 4 times in the back. Roger Holloman had been shot 3 times in the back and shot once in the back of the neck. Police found the dead bodies the next day and the men were convicted of these murders. People v. Collins, 1985. Even though these royal family members were being sought for the November 12 triple murder, they still managed to kill Clarita Ladd on December 2, 1980, in a South Side shootout with a gang only said to be the Disciples. The shootout could have been with either black gangster disciples or black disciples, but most likely black gangster disciples as they were disputing over drug turf on the South Side. The rampage of the royal family continued in 1980, and the leadership was being sought as authorities were especially after Roger Collins, Maurice Powell and Murray Hooper, but the three men had fled to Phoenix, Arizona after they committed these drug-related murders. The trio had flown to Arizona because they were handed down a contract from the Chicago outfit to kill a print shop business owner named William Redmond. The contract was passed down by Robert "Fat Man" Cruz that had connected with the royal family when he was in jail with Roger Collins and Murray Hooper back in 1971. Now almost a decade later, Cruz needed the royal family's assistance as removing Redmond, who was in the way of Cruz's real estate interest. Cruz had moved to Arizona to get involved in the real estate business, which is why he had interest in this property that Redmond refused to give up. Cruz now offered $10,000 to the royal family to kill Redmond. On December 31, 1980, Murray Hooper, Roger Collins and a former Chicago policeman Edward McCall burst into the home of Redmond. The men then tied up Redmond, his wife and his 70-year-old mother-in-law. They were laid on the bed and shot in the back of the head execution style. After they were killed, Murray Hooper slit Redmond's throat to show the outfit that they were brutal killers and should be hired again. The three men were arrested for these murders. Edward McCall was the first one to be taken down. He then hired his lawyer Michael Pritzker to get him out of the charges. When Pritzker failed to get McCall out of the charges completely, unknown gunmen attempted to kill Pritzker right outside his home in Chicago. Pritzker knew the gunman but refused to divulge who shot him and dropped McCall as his client. Murray Hooper ended up admitting the killing and named his boss Roger Collins as involved in the murder. This led to the conviction of Roger Collins, and now he was headed back to prison in 1981. Goon Squad boss George "Booney" Black Davis was also headed to prison in 1981. On May 6, 1981, at the apartment of Linda Dates located at 1440 South Kedzie, 15th and Kedzie, in the North Lawndale neighborhood, three men came to her door that she recognized according to court documents as members of the Black Gangster Disciples, or at least that is the rumor she heard. The men were George "Booney" Black, Edward Black Davis, Moto also referred to as Johnny Gat, and Smokey, also known as Curtis Taylor Lee. The men came to the apartment to allegedly buy $100 worth of cocaine from Lex Leaks, who was known in the neighborhood to be a cocaine dealer according to court documents. Apparently an argument broke out between Johnny Gat and Leaks about the weight of the cocaine that resulted in a shootout that left Leaks dead and his roommate wounded. Shortly after the murder, police attempted to apprehend the men, but all of them tried to flee and destroy evidence, including George Davis, after the police came to his apartment at 3317 West Madison and Spalding, in East Garfield Park. When police came to arrest Davis, he ran into an abandoned apartment and locked himself in, then fled down the stairwell with a shotgun in his hand after he dropped evidence, which was other firearms. Davis surrendered eventually. According to court documents, George Davis had been released from prison within 5 years and had violated his parole. George "Booney" Black Davis's gang affiliations were not very known, as was shown in the court documents when he was convicted of armed robbery and attempted murder in 1981. In the year 1981, after Booney was brought back to prison, he had disagreements with the Black Gangster Disciples organization he was part of, so he split from BGD and combined his goon squad gangsters with royal family to create the Black Gangster Nation. Right after this move, the Black Gangsters pledged into the Folk Alliance, but this didn't stop a war between BGDs and BGs in the prison system. The war was brief and the two organizations settled down as allies shortly after. Booney was placed in charge of the Black Gangsters as Collins was in charge of the royal family aspect, and Booney was still in charge of the goons. After the Black Gangsters formed in 1981, they made a conquest of the suburb of Zion, Illinois, and also the Abla housing projects, the Village. The Black Gangsters conflicted heavily with the traveling vice lords and conservative vice lords when they entered these projects. Many of the Black Gangster disciples in these projects flipped to become Black Gangsters because they preferred how this new nation was ran. The leadership of this new organization knew how to make money on the streets and aggressively pursued drug turf while violently wiping out competition. The old ways of the 1970s royal family and goon squad were installed in young impressionable members living in the village in the 1980s, which turned many young members into cold-hearted killers and serious gangsters. The way of this organization was to not let anything stop them, especially the traveling vice lords that had heavily armed security in the village and the crumbling high-rises of the notorious Grace Abbott projects. Black gangsters did not like having to rely on allies to get by, but sometimes it was necessary now that they were in this to make larger sums of money by selling drugs in the public housing projects on the south side and west side, Harold Ickes and the Blah projects. The ally that gave the Black Gangsters the most grief was the Black Gangster Disciples. That was another organization that was heavily involved in the selling of large amounts of drugs in the public housing projects. It was about 1992 when the Black Gangsters began to have issues not only within their own organization, but also with the Gangster Disciples and Black Soul street gangs. Legend has it that Maurice King Baldy Jackson was having sex with members of the black gangsters behind prison walls, as he allegedly ordered members to do these acts with him, whether they were willing or not. This possible founder that went by the nickname Gam was allegedly the one that exploited Baldy's wrongdoing and had him killed because homosexual acts were not tolerated within the BGN. In about the same year of 1992, another high-ranking black gangster known as Gabby allegedly flipped to a black soul because he was beaten for violating BG codes of conduct. Gabby was angry and flipped to a black soul. Then he attempted assassination of Booney Black behind prison walls as Black Souls viciously stabbed Booney several times. Rumor is that Booney Black then went to the gangster disciples for assistance and a blessing to take out Gabby, but the GDs turned him down. Legend has it that Davis then became angered and severed ties to the gangsters' disciples and instead clicked up with the black disciples who were then enemies of the GDs. The black gangsters then only kept 3 of the 6 folk nation concepts: love, life and loyalty, but dropped the rest of the literature. The organization now had an alternate name known as the Triple LS. After this event, the black gangsters sought revenge on Larry Hoover for turning down assistance to deal with the Souls. Perhaps Larry wanted to protect the Souls because the Souls were close to David Barksdale, and Larry wanted to withhold that relationship. Regardless, the black gangsters didn't agree, and that's when Nissan attempted to stab Larry Hoover in Statesville, and that's when the war got very heated between black gangsters and gangster disciples. In the same year of 1992, a younger group of black gangsters broke away and called themselves New Breeds or Triple L Breeds. These young bloods were even more aggressive than the black gangsters under the rule of Booney Black as they moved into new territory at 16th and Costner, New Life Breeds, in the North Lawndale neighborhood where they clicked up with Black Souls. The Breeds also opened up in West Garfield Park and clicked up with the Black Souls in that community as they battled several Vice Lord factions. The Breeds stormed the Austin neighborhood and the East Garfield Park neighborhood, claiming the area known as Fifth City. The Breeds even opened territory in the West Humboldt Park community as they battled with conservative Vice Lords and Latin Kings. The Breeds severed ties to the Folk Nation Alliance, especially since many of the members were not in prison and did not require an alliance to survive in the streets. George Davis was not presiding over the New Breeds, they had their own leader. The interesting thing is that the Breeds were young relatives of Booney, direct from his own bloodline. This may be why no major war was launched between them, however Booney was not happy. Within a very short time, George Davis offered to combine forces, once again making the black gangsters strictly a prison entity, while the Breeds would be the street entity. It was an excellent arrangement for both parties because members were governed in the streets by a different leader and were able to be allies with any folk or people nation gang they wanted. If members became incarcerated, they were governed by Booney and were now considered black gangsters and were folks. This arrangement very likely was only established because the Breeds were family to Booney, if not there very well may have been war between BGs and Breeds. The Breeds were now able to expand further now that they were overall ran by George Davis as they opened new territory on the south side of Chicago in the greater Grand Crossing neighborhood, Englewood neighborhood, Roseland neighborhood and Auburn Gresham. The Breeds also were able to set up small drug operations in the Altgeld Gardens projects in Riverdale, the Cabrini Green projects in the near North Side neighborhoods, and Jeffrey Manor in the South Deering community. The Breeds also opened new suburban turf besides their Zion chapter. Now they had chapters in Bellwood, Maywood, Harvey, Robbins, Rockford, Aurora and Peoria. Breeds traveled into other states like Indiana, Louisiana, Wisconsin and Georgia. Breeds and black disciples became very close in relationship as they both were heavily at war with gangster disciples over drug turf. Both Breeds and BDs established the trays both ways concept, as 3 fingers could symbolize both gangs, the LLL for Breeds and the 3 for BDs. This alliance has deep roots stemming back to when Booney took his goon squad gangsters into the Black Disciple Alliance in the 1960s. The Breeds have grown to over 4,000 members over the years and are known to be very quick to use their guns. Many bodies have come up during gang wars between Breeds and their adversaries, and most of the time it is their enemy that ends up dead. It is said that the Breeds wiped out a major chunk of the traveling Vice Lord's territory in the village. Regardless if that happened or not, the Breeds became the largest gang in the Obla projects as they viciously battled Vice Lord factions and gangster disciples in those projects until the majority of them were torn down. The Breeds were founded by black organized crime members that had heavy ties to the Italian Chicago outfit. Breeds were born out of men that were cold-blooded killers that would very easily take a life without blinking. Collins first connected with the Italian outfit in 1971 and later became a co-founder of this organization. Booney Black was another co-founder that was a hardened gangster that had no fear and was known to be serious business. It was even rumored that he shook down the Italian outfit at one point in time. Booney dressed well and like an old-time gangster. Booney led an extortion operation and most of his customers scrambled to pay him as quickly as possible. Many just paid because Booney looked scary. Booney was tall with big wide eyes and had a handlebar mustache making him look ferocious. Not only that, his record of violent crime proved he could be dangerous if crossed. In one such incident, a man owed Booney money and did not pay, so Booney tied him to a chair, then put a large machete on the burner of an oven until it was scalding hot, then pressed it against the man's face as he screamed in pain. George Booney Black Davis was considered the last Don and the last of a dying breed. He was heavily honored, and when he died in 2009 at the age of 71, almost every member of the new breed showed up to pay respect. The Black Souls started in 1962 in the near West Side neighborhood at the old roller rink at 2550 West Madison Street, Madison and Rockwell, as a roller skating group. The organization was founded by Horace King Pee Wee Willis. Horace Willis and the earliest Black Souls were roller skaters that often skated in the James Brown style, JB style, skating that became very popular in Chicago in the 1960s. I am not sure of all the details, but King Pee Wee was a musician of some sort as well and was said to be the one that introduced the downbeat to the west side of Chicago. The Black Souls were not formed for the purposes of gangbanging. They were a group of friends that hung out on the west side, that loved music and skate dancing, that got into some trouble at times. There was no drug selling or shootings the Souls were into, they just hung out and were really into music. The Souls would hang out down the street from the rink at the intersection of Madison and California in the East Garfield Park neighborhood, so you can also say that is where it all started too. Another part of the history was the creation of the Soul Brothers that started in East Garfield Park around Homan and Madison in about the same year. Another interesting fact is that Horace Willis had a childhood friend from the neighborhood by the name of Hector Pancho Sanchez. In 1962, Pancho moved out of the neighborhood as several Puerto Rican people began leaving East Garfield Park, but the boys remained friends, and as Willis created the Black Souls in 1962, Hector created the Latin Souls in the back of the Yards neighborhood. This is the story of how Black Souls and Latin Souls have a long-standing unity. The Black Souls became quite popular in the 1960s, and this caught the attention of David Barksdale and the Black Disciples from the South Side. The Black Disciples campaigned all over the city from South Side to West Side to North Side, taking in many organizations into their alliance starting in 1966. Sometime between 1966 and 1968 the Souls joined the Black Disciple Alliance, but were mostly left out on their own, since they were on the West Side and the rest of the Disciples were South Side. The Black Souls never represented their disciple affiliation because of this reason. By the late 1960s there were about 80 members of the Black Souls, and they now had established a section at Adams and Pulaski in the West Garfield Park neighborhood, and they frequented a playlot that used to exist at this intersection. In these years the Black Souls met the Latin Kings for the first time as Latin Kings came through this area. The confrontation was peaceful, and for this one day Black Souls and Latin Kings hung out briefly at this park. In the year 1970 tragedy came to the Black Souls that scarred this organization forever and changed the group. Horace Willis was attempting to rob a store, and when the Chicago police arrived, they shot Willis over 30 times in his back, even though Willis had not hurt anyone in the robbery. The killing was a senseless slaughter, and there was no reason to shoot him over 30 times, therefore, his death was considered a homicide, and his mother sued the police department and won. The officers that killed him were never convicted to my knowledge. After the death of Horace Willis the Black Souls went into a different direction. The Black Souls were enraged over King Pee Wee's death. The nature of the killing caused further rage how a man was shot 30 times with his back turned. The Souls then changed their name to the Mad Black Souls to possibly honor King Pee Wee and to signify their outrage. In April of 1978 the Folk and People alliances were formed in prison. Black Souls were of course expected to join one of the alliances but had no choice but to decline both sides. Mad Black Souls instead only drew up an alliance with the Four Corner Hustlers of Madison and Homan in the East Garfield Park area. This developed the 440+ concept in 1978. The Gangster Black Souls were heavily unified with Black Gangster Disciples, and joining people would severely damage that unity, therefore, Souls couldn't ride with either side. Souls also did not split between MBS and GBS because family was first, and the two groups were unified more than they were with GBS and MBS. Regardless of the fact the Souls stayed out of Folk and People, it was still believed by law enforcement and many on the street that they were folks, but Souls just let the rumors travel and let it be, it just kept their organization more of a mystery. There were some soul groups that went renegade over time and claimed folk alliance on the streets, but such groups never lasted or were set straight in prison. In the year 1981, just as Folk and People spread to the streets of Chicago, a new group of Black Souls formed called the Impressionist Black Souls. The Impressionists were allied with the Four Corner Hustlers just like MBS and were also at war with BGDs and Folks. IBS began at Wilcox and Pulaski in the West Garfield Park neighborhood, a long-held territory that used to be exclusively owned by MBS, but some MBS became IBS in 1981. Sometimes wars have happened between IBS and MBS, but mostly both groups have held that corner for decades. On December 9, 1983, the Black Souls murdered a Vice Lord Chief by the name of Jerome Wells. According to court documents, Black Soul members were infuriated over the death of Black Soul member Tom Slick, and now they wanted revenge. According to court documents, about 8 or 9 members of the Black Souls met at gang member Eddie Wood's apartment that was located somewhere on Van Buren Street. Woods had a whole lot of guns in his apartment and was able to pass them out. He was also able to test one of the shotguns out in the hallway, which shows that obviously residents were not bothered by gunshots in the building. The Black Souls marked Vice Lord Chief Jerome Wells for death, and Wells lived right across a vacant lot in an apartment building next door. This is also the building where Black Soul member Larry Gross's mother lived. The plan was for 4 teams of 2 gang members each to go across the open lot and into the nearby building and into Larry Gross's mom's apartment and drink beer until the lookout told them Wells was coming. Later on they made it the building, and Wells came home to his 7th floor apartment. He was then ambushed by Black Souls and shot several times. Larry Gross, Eddie Woods, John Mahogany and Willie Atkins were all charged with murder, People vs. Atkins. This murder showed that the Black Souls would retaliate heavily if a rival gang would kill one of their own. Sometime in about the mid-1980s or perhaps a little later, the Black Souls ventured into the North Lawndale neighborhood and came across a gang that dominated 16th and Pulaski to 16th and 16th and Harding. This section was known as the Black Outlaw Soul Brothers, which was a section that viciously fought against the Vice Lords. The Outlaw Soul Brothers guarded their territory tightly and expected rival Vice Lords to comply. On the night of January 22, 1984, Vice Lord gang members Keith Chip Jordan had become a victim of a brutal gang beating from the Outlaw Soul Brothers. According to court documents, Keith Jordan was walking alone through Soul Brother territory at 16th and Harding when Soul Brother gang members Kenneth Keno Anderson, Zell and Larry Glasgow flashed gang signs at Jordan and screamed out "Folks pop, people drop." A series of hand signs were exchanged as Soul Brothers threw down the Vice Lords. Then the 3 Soul Brothers Chaz Jordan, who slipped and fell, Zell and Glasgow proceeded to beat Jordan with a pipe and a large wooden stick, then Keno jumped in to attack Jordan. The only reason the men stopped was because a female witness began screaming, then they wanted to go after her when she tried to help Jordan, but she managed to run away and call police. According to court documents, Jordan died later of severe head trauma, and Zell and Glasgow were not convicted, but Kenneth Keno Anderson was. Sam McKay became a leader of the gangster Black Souls, while Wayne Edwards still had a lot of power in the organization. Sam's reign lasted throughout the 1980s and 1990s until he was put in prison in 1992, which is when Wayne Edwards controlled all street operations. By 1992, when McKay was put in prison, Edwards took over another new group of souls called the New Life Impressionist Black Souls. This gang posted at 19th and Pulaski in North Lawndale. Sam McKay was definitely in charge of the Black Souls by 1987 at the latest. On November 13, 1987, according to court documents in the case of People vs. Murray, Sam McKay ordered the deaths of Brian Fowler and D. Buck. Fowler and Buck were selling drugs near the intersection of Fulton and Kedzie in the East Garfield Park neighborhood. The Black Souls were running a major drug house at address 3233 West Fulton, which was right at that intersection, and these young drug dealers were infringing on McKay's turf, according to court documents. McKay got together with Kevin Murray, Jet Paris and Tyrone Washington to plan out the murder, and Jet brought in a gym bag with 2 Uzi machine guns. McKay said the 2 must die according to court documents. Kevin Murray then became the driver and escorted Jet and Washington to go out looking for the 2 dealers. Eventually they spotted the 2 dealers, then Jet and Washington got out of the car and shot the 2 dealers dead in a back alley by 3300 West Fulton. They then got in the car driven by Murray, who served as the getaway driver and was also said to be Sam McKay's personal driver, according to court documents. Kevin Murray also was a drug dealer and a member of the Black Souls that moved large amounts of drugs under McKay, according to court documents. Murray and Washington were charged with murder and sentenced to life in prison. For some reason, Sam McKay was never brought up on charges in this case. People vs. Murray, 1993. The Black Souls were very serious about their drug turf from the start, and this was apparent in the November 13, 1987 murder of 2 rival drug dealers. Another example of the Black Souls flexing their muscles in East Garfield Park came on the night of August 4, 1990, at the intersection of Adams and Francisco. At this intersection is a 2-story apartment building. John Screwball Barnes was running a crack cocaine operation on the 2nd floor of the building that was rented by his tenants, Claude Blood Benson, J.C. and Floyd Spencer. Screwball supplied the drugs and brought it the building and would give the drugs to Carol Ramsey, who would then give the drugs to Charles Williams, who sold the drugs in the apartment while Benson collected the money and brought the profits back to the Black Souls, which Benson was a member of according to court documents. Carol Ramsey lived in the building on the first floor with a gangster disciple gang member named Reginald Jett. Drug users were able to stay inside the building and smoke their crack, which meant this place was a smokehouse. This crack house was jointly operated by members of the Black Souls and the Gangster Disciples. I am not sure if Screwball was a member of either gang. On the night of August 4, Claude Benson argued with Carol Ramsey that Screwball owed the Black Souls money, and because of this the drug operation had to cease activity or the building would be burned down. When Screwball allegedly refused according to court documents, a Gangster Disciple gang member and Jeffrey Todd Wilson, a Black Soul gang member, then doused the place in gasoline, then lit it on fire while they yelled for everyone to get out. After that there were 2 explosions as the building blew up. The men were paid $200 to light the fire according to court documents. 2 men died in the blast, Floyd Spencer and Lee Burnett. Wilson was charged with murder and sentenced to life in prison. People vs. Wilson, 1998. The Black Souls kept a smooth operation throughout the 1970s and 1980s, not gaining much publicity. In fact, up until the 1990s the Black Souls were thought of as a black gangster disciple faction and nothing more, especially since the gangster Black Souls faction had such tight relations with GDs on the west side and south side. The Souls set up shop all over West Garfield Park and Greater Grand Crossing communities eventually. They opened up in the Rockwell Gardens housing projects in the near West Side neighborhood. The Souls also opened territory in the Abla housing projects in the near West Side neighborhood and immediately had vicious gang wars with the new breeds. By the 1990s the Black Souls were being targeted by law enforcement for selling millions of dollars worth of drugs in the streets. The Souls were a major threat because of their complex drug trade and their propensity for violence if their drug turf was to be infringed on. In some areas, GBS areas, Gangster Disciples and Souls are allies, while in other areas they are at war, in MBS, IBS and NLBS zones. The outlaw Soul Brothers are no longer active and have not been a long time. In fact, at 16th and Homan, the war with Vice Lords ceased and mad Black Souls and conservative Vice Lords hang out there. On 15th and Christiana MBS hangs with traveling Vice Lords and Four Corner Hustlers. The mad Black Souls main base has become Walnut and Homan in East Garfield Park as they have been as war with Gangster Disciples and unknown Vice Lords. MBS here is cool with traveling Vice Lords from Chicago Avenue and St. Louis. The Souls have had legendary wars with the new breeds and Vice Lords, but in other parts of the city they are business partners. The Souls do not need to ally with Fokker people. The Souls operate like a chameleon, they adopt their surroundings to get what they need and survive, and this is how they have grown over the years and even opened up in the suburbs and other states, while multiplying into the thousands. The Maniac Latin Disciple early history is indeed fascinating, as they have deep ties to the Gangster Disciples and Black Disciples that date far back in time. It begins in the year 1966, the same year several African American street gangs united under the Black Disciple umbrella on the south side of Chicago. Since 1961, Disciples were operating in the Cabrini Green public housing projects on Chicago's north side. Devil's Disciples and Black Disciples attended Wells High School and other elementary schools in the area, as that was part of their district. All children from all over West Town also attended the same high school, which is located on the borders of Ukrainian Village, East Humboldt Park and Wicker Park. Young Rican youths from Rockwell and Potomac in East Humboldt Park attending the same schools as Black Disciples soon became influenced by them. These kids had problems with some white greaser gangs in the area like the C-Notes, Gaylords, PVPs and various others. These kids had family members that were Milwaukee Kings, Latin Kings and various others. They had no issues with Rican gangs, however, these boys didn't want to join the nearby Latin Kings around Von Humboldt School. Instead they were enticed into joining the Disciples and to gain entry into the Black Disciple Nation. The youths from Rockwell and Potomac could only gain this entry into the Black Disciples if they were to create their own gang for Hispanics. This is when Latin Disciple was created in 1966. The boys went in different directions. Albert Hernandez was one of the leaders and creators of a Latin Disciple group and simply called his group of young teens Latin Disciples. The second group was the Bruce Lee Latin Disciples that was led by Pete the Burner Coria. Down the street more toward Rockwell and Crystal, Jose Freckle Sedeno led the Almighty Latin Disciples. At the beginning there were 3 different Latin Disciple gangs at this intersection. The Disciple Future high-up members were a strong part of this area since the beginning. Future leader Jose Sedeno's mother owned a corner store right on Rockwell and Potomac named Santa's Store, and the family lived on the first floor in 1967. Jose himself moved onto the second floor with his girlfriend Anna. Edwin Mousy Barrios moved onto the third floor and was also a big-time MLD in later years. The Latin disciples liked to help out the community at Rockwell and Potomac in the East Humboldt Park neighborhood. The disciples treated many people in the community with respect. They would even stick up for people that were being bullied by neighborhood gangs. This led to conflicts with Latin kings, warlords, and Spanish lords, not white gangs like Gangland says, especially not Gaylords and Harrison Gents that were never in East Humboldt Park. The disciples hung out with the Milwaukee Kings as their closest allies. The two clubs partied and patrolled together. During the ferocious blizzard of 1967, the disciples volunteered to shovel snow for people in the community. They did this for weeks and again the next winter. This eventually became a thing the gang did, if you was a member. This got Albert Hernandez and his 11 other disciples pictured in the Chicago Daily News newspaper in 1967, which is the photo that was used for the History Channel's Gangland show. It is surprising that Hernandez was almost 13 years old in that photo. In the year 1968, the Latin disciples opened the door to more recruitment as they began taking blacks, Mexicans, Polish, German and just about any type of individuals with many backgrounds. Albert Hernandez was charismatic, and being linked to the notorious Devil's Disciples brought more notoriety. Soon disciple numbers would swell to over 100 members at Rockwell and Potomac in the late 60s. This was also the time when Albert Hernandez called for a unity between Latin disciples, Almighty Latin disciples and Bruce Lee disciples, to create one nation known as Latin disciples. Albert Hernandez was then appointed as the leader of the Latin disciples and was regarded as a king. In the late 1960s, the Latin disciples befriended the Spanish Cobras as they moved on to Maplewood and Division. This was the beginning of a very close relationship with the Cobras that would eventually evolve into one of the most bitter rivalries in Chicago history. On the day of January 18, 1972, Albert Hernandez was out at Rockwell and Potomac as usual when Latin King gang members came into the neighborhood and were harassing one of the Polish members of the LDs. Hernandez was doing what he did best in sticking up for others, and this is what led to the Latin Kings pulling a knife and stabbing him to death. Albert Hernandez was killed a few months before turning 18. Hernandez was said to be a big reader of Adolf Hitler because he admired the dictator's play for power. In reality, there was no known interest Hernandez had in the socialist dictator. This story may have been spun after his death to make him look like a ruler of the disciples. The title of king was said to be what Hernandez wanted to call himself. However, when he was alive, the title of king did not exist within the Latin disciples. That title was given to Hernandez after his death, and he was known as King Hitler. This also plays into the legends that Hernandez was a drug dealer and had his disciples selling lots of drugs, while Hernandez took a taxed amount from each member. The truth is Hernandez was not even a dealer, and the disciples did not even start dealing drugs in high volume until years after his death. Hernandez did not even open any new territory during his years. Rockwell and Potomac was all there was between 1966 and 1972, and there was no Hirsch in Rockwell and no Latin scorpions mixed in with MLD history. Many of the original disciples left the gang after Hernandez was killed, and especially the vast majority were long gone by the late 1970s, when the drug game became huge. Members of the Latin disciples and Milwaukee Kings got revenge for the killing of Hernandez. Even though there was no arrests made for the Hernandez murder, the streets knew which Latin king did it, and revenge was given to that Latin king that was found dead later. There were no known arrests for that murder either. The Latin disciples were infuriated over the death of Hernandez, and it was the first time they would suffer the death of a leader. The Latin disciples then launched a full-scale war on the Latin kings led by their new leader Prince Diablo. Out of respect for Hitler, the title king died along with Hernandez, and at that point forward the new title would be Prince. Prince Diablo was the first to carry this title until the late 1970s. After Albert Hernandez passed away, the Latin disciples colonized the West Humboldt Park neighborhood, where they conflicted more with Latin kings and Simon City royals in that area. As stated earlier, a bond developed between Spanish Cobras and Latin disciples, and this led some disciples and Cobras to call themselves Almighty back in the early 1970s. The Latin lovers were also Almighty when they formed in 1973, but this all was short-lived after the disciples started Maniac concepts for their senior members in 1973. Also in 1973, Pete the Burner Coria was arrested and supposedly thrown from the police station window. In his trial he cussed out the judge and said he was a maniac. Therefore, since 1973 the Maniac part of the name was born and Maniac concepts were created. The Latin disciples now had structure under Maniac, as members would start out as Pee-wee Latin disciples, then become Young Latin disciples. Next they would become Young Future Latin disciples, then after that it was Future Latin disciples. The final title was to become a Maniac, and they would then be Maniac Latin disciples. The violence between Latin kings and Latin disciples led to incarcerations of many Latin disciple members in the early 1970s, including co-founder Rudy Rios, who found himself in prison by 1974. In 1976, the Latin disciples and Spanish Cobras formed an alliance called the Young Latino Organization. Then in 1978 the unity was expanded to the Imperial Gangsters and Latin Eagles to form the United Latino Organization, or ULO, that reached other various clubs that hung out with them like Orquestra Albany. In the year 1977, the Maniac Latin disciples opened up territory out of Urs and division in the West Humboldt Park neighborhood, thus beginning the West Humboldt Park operations. April 1978, Larry Hoover sat down with the leaders of both allied gangs and enemy gangs in Stateville Correctional Facility and created the Folk Nation Alliance, while his enemies created the People Nation Alliance at the same time. It was at this meeting where the Latin disciples joined the Folk Nation, since they were already part of the Black Gangster Disciples Alliance. Out of this Folk Nation unity was the Latin Familia, or Latin family, which was a unity of folks that would work to strengthen the Latino gangs such as the Latin Disciples, Spanish Cobras, Satan Disciples, Imperial Gangsters, Latin Eagles, Ashland Vikings, Orquestra Albany, Ambrose, and 2-6. This would end up helping the Latin disciples to expand their drug empire, especially now that they could walk the streets united with Simon City Royals, Spanish Cobras and Imperial Gangsters. Months before the Folk Nation was created, Prince Diablo was no longer in charge, and Prince Ramon Vasquez took over leadership of the Pee-wees, while 23-year-old Jose Prince Freckles Sedeno was running the whole nation. Shortly after Vasquez took over the Pee-wees, an allied Rican gang within their territory were losing the battle in the Logan Square community with the Gaylords, Simon City Royals and Latin Kings, but their biggest issue was with the Simon City Royals from Christiana and Wellington. Simon City Royals would attack these youths and beat them up while they tried to go to school, just because they were Rican. One of the members targeted was Lord Chino, who was a tough street warrior along with his gang. The problem was they were outnumbered. These youths reached out to Prince Vasquez for assistance. The prince agreed, but only if all of the Rockwell and Potomac gang agreed to become a part of the Latin disciples. Lord Chino agreed and adopted the tags and symbols of the Latin disciples, and a new section had begun. Prince Vasquez gave his blessing. The Logan Square MLDs were born at Kedzie and Barry in 1978. Kedzie and Barry would go on to become a legendary section with some of the toughest MLDs. Shortly after Kedzie and Barry was established, Prince Vasquez was shot and killed by a member of the Insane Unknowns named Miguel Vargas in 1978. He was arrested for the crime and tried in court. The disciples were infuriated over this murder and were now in a full-scale war with the Insane Unknowns. At this point in time, Sedeno was running a major drug ring at Rockwell and Potomac thanks to the connections of Latin disciple Hugo Juice Herrera, who had ties to the notorious Herrera family drug cartel. This eventually brought heavy police attention by October of 1979. Juice was a Latin disciple from Kedzie and Barry, so the real connection came from the Logan Square section and not from Rockwell and Potomac, even though the operation took place at the Twilight Zone. In 1979, Spanish Cobras and Latin disciples both agreed to create a divide on the streets that categorized maniacs and insanes. All the closet allies with Spanish Cobras would be known as insanes, while the closest allies with Latin disciples became maniacs. This divide was non-violent and the ULO and YLO alliance remained intact. This was just a way to create two families and to make Maniac more official. Latin disciples had been calling themselves Maniacs since 1973, but now in 1979 allies would be known as Maniacs as well. These allies included the Milwaukee Kings, Latin Jivers, Latin Lovers and Latin Stylers. By mid-July 1980, the DEA and the Chicago Police's organized crime unit closed in on the drug operation that originally started at just Rockwell and Potomac, but soon spread to 4 other locations on the north side and northwest side. 46 people were arrested instantly in this drug bust, mostly Latin disciples, and the police were out looking to arrest 17 others from the gang. The police said in a statement to the press that you could buy any drug you wanted at Rockwell and Potomac and that the cars and people were literally lined up waiting to get their drugs. 1 year earlier, on July 4, 1979, Sedeno was arrested for running a drug ring at the same corner of Rockwell and Potomac along with 2 other street corners, Washtenaw and Hirsch, and also at Evergreen and Washtenaw in cooperation with the Spanish Cobras. 18 members of both gangs were arrested, but they got away with it. Prince Jose was able to restart up his operation months later, once again based on Rockwell and Potomac, but in 1980 he finally got convicted. This showed now the Latin disciples were heavily in the drug business. Prince Jose was the one that started the Latin disciples on a path of highly complex drug operations and made the Latin disciples regard Rockwell and Potomac even more as a sacred corner. In the year 1980, a high-ranking incarcerated Maniac Latin disciples named Victor Gomez or King Vic and gang leader Ronald Mad Dog Carrasculo of the Imperial Gangsters drew up a constitution for a way to govern the Latin folks behind prison walls. The Latin folks consisted of all the Hispanic gangs that were part of the Folk Alliance that included all 4 of the ULO organizations. This established alliance would become known as the Spanish Gangster Disciples or La Tabla. This establishment was approved and sanctioned by Larry Hoover, who was the leader of the Black Gangster Disciples and the chairman of the Folk Alliance. This new order also allowed King Vic to appoint more gangs into the Folk Alliance as they also joined SGD. After José Cedeno was put away in prison, a new leader emerged to take control of the Latin disciples. This would be 19-year-old Fernando Prince Ferni Zayas. Zayas would continue on where Cedeno left off, expanding the empire and bringing in drug profits. On July 2, 1983, Prince Ferni wanted to let the insane unknowns know that he did not forget about Ramon Prince Vasquez. Zayas even had a tattoo on his left hand paying respect to the former prince. On Friday night, July 1, 1983, Zayas and his friends were partying it up when word was that Miguel Vargas was in the area hanging out with his friends on the porch watching TV after 1 a.m. that night. Zayas hated Vargas because back in 1978 Vargas, then 15 years old, shot and killed Prince Ramon. In 1979 Vargas pleaded guilty to the murder in juvenile court, however, he was back on the streets by 1983 and Zayas was gunning for him to avenge Vasquez. On that Friday night, early Saturday morning, Zayas, along with Jose Baby Rodriguez and 2 others, took a car from Juanita Rodriguez without her knowing. The car pulled up to the apartments at 1438 West Catalpa in the Andersonville section of the Edgewater neighborhood. Here Vargas was with his 2 friends Ruben Gutierrez, 20 years old, and Luis Quaresma, 17 years old. They were watching the outdoor TV on the first floor and talking. Zayas and 1 other Latin disciple got out of the car and fired several shots at the 3 on the porch. The main target Miguel Vargas was killed at the scene along with 1 other, and the 3rd died at a nearby hospital. Zayas and the MLDs got their revenge for the killing and celebrated later that night. At first, the Latin disciples got away with the killing, until later that month, witnesses started coming forward and saying they either saw Zayas do the killing or they heard him brag about it. This led to Zayas getting arrested by August. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to 2 life sentences which he is still serving. In the year 1983, the Kedzie and Barry MLDs came to the Avondale neighborhood at Barry in California and flipped a club called the Brands Park Party People into MLDs, placing Mo and Froggy in charge of the section. This brought the birth of MLDs in Avondale. Incarceration did not stop Prince Ferni from running the Latin disciples. He was still the prince of the nation, and for the first time, the Latin disciples on the street were being controlled by an imprisoned leader. As the 1980s progressed, the Latin disciples grew in size into the hundreds in gang membership. They also spread their influence outside of East and West Humboldt Park. They gained new territory in Bucktown, Hermosa, North Center, Southern West Town, Rosemont and California, Taylor and Oakley, Gage Park, on the south side, Irving Park and Avondale. These additional territories would open all throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s. The strongest sections would still be Rockwell and Potomac and Talman and Wabancha. West Humboldt Park influence spread further in the mid-1980s as Division and Avers MLDs opened the Springfield and Grant section in Grant City. Starting in 1987, newer Spanish Cobras and Latin disciples did not get along, as well as the older members of each gang. Fistfights would break out and other kinds of drama between both gangs that older members completely avoided. Instead, the older members organized the conflicts. The older members would bring the younger members into a schoolyard and let them have a big brawl to get all the frustrations out, then after that there was peace. It was sort of like being a parent having young siblings that don't get along, make them fight it out, and then shake hands afterward. This was a great way of keeping the Folk Alliance intact, but it was still concerning that the younger members of Cobras and Disciples were having these conflicts to begin with. For these next 5 years, this is how conflicts were effectively resolved. In 1989, the relations with Maniacs was mostly tight, as only the usual skirmishes among the younger members were the worst thing to happen with fellow folks. Things got very serious in 1989 when an argument happened at a party with the Western and Cortez Imperial Gangsters. One of the MLDs got into it with Flaco G of the Imperial Gangsters. This led to the MLD shooting Flaco G dead at the party. Angry feelings ensued, but a war was not initiated as an agreement was reached. The real anger came months later when another MLD shot and killed another Imperial gangster, and the IGs threatened war if the MLDs did not turn over the shooter. The MLDs refused, and this started a very nasty war between the Maniac Latin disciples and Imperial gangsters. This became the first major folk against folk war on the northern part of the city. The war with the Western and Cortez Imperial Gangsters was nasty over the next 2 years as several shootings went down between them. Very frequently, Imperial Gangsters would take shots at MLDs right after school, at nearby Roberto Clemente High School. This led to Flintstone G of the Imperial Gangsters making an attempted assassination on a rising disciple Junior Prince, until he ran out of bullets then start running. He cut through the gangway at Augusta and Cortez, where an MLD was waiting in the alley for him, and shot him dead. At the end of 1991, going into 1992, the Imperial Gangster and Maniac Latin Disciple War ended for the time being. In 1992, the skirmishes between Insanes and Maniacs became even more frequent. It boiled into the first major war between Cobras and Disciples as a series of shootouts happened for a week straight. It was so bad that the rivalry even made it on the news. The war was stopped once older members stepped in and put an end to it. Another bad incident happened in April of 1992, when the MLDs accused Orlando of the Spanish Cobras of selling them bad drugs. The MLDs swiftly got vengeance by shooting Orlando to death. This started a major riot in the streets between Cobras and Disciples that went on for 2 days. This made the news as well. The Kedzie and Barry MLDs were the ones involved on the Disciples side. The guns blazed all around Logan Square for about 4 days, as both gangs were hitting each other with shots until it was resolved. In the aftermath of the 1992 war, the Insane and Maniac families made their organizations more official than ever before and intensified the divide. Now Cobras went by Insane Spanish Cobra, while Latin Disciples now went by Maniac Latin Disciple at all times. This divide now caused their allies to back up Cobras or Maniacs whenever there was violence going on against each other. Another group splintered out of ULO known as the Almighty Alliance. This alliance included the Simon City Royals, Insane Popes, Latin Eagles and Imperial Gangsters. Before 1992, being a Maniac Latin Disciple was more of a title for older members and was the highest ranking set in the organization, but now Maniac was fully part of the name for the whole nation, even the younger members. If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel and also don't forget to click on the notification bell so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network.